Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. None of us could fully process what we were seeing, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. There, standing in front of us, was Adon, naked, drenched in blood, and no longer the guy we once knew. His eyes were darker, almost animalistic, as if there was something lurking beneath the surface, something monstrous. Kately, and took a step back, her voice shaky. Adon, what happened to you? Adon chuckled, his voice low and menacing. It's like I said before, you don't become a werewolf by getting bitten. You drink the water. We all froze, the realization sinking in. It wasn't just some stupid legend to spook us around the bonfire. It was real. Adon had drunk the water, and now he was the thing of nightmares. Why, you're lying, Caitlin stammered, backing up until she hit the kitchen counter. This isn't happening. It can't be. Adon smirked, his eyes scanning the room as though he was deciding who to target next. His body still twitched occasionally, as if his transformation wasn't fully complete, but that didn't make him any less dangerous. I swallowed hard, trying to think, trying to come up with some sort of plan, but my mind was blank. All I could focus on was Heather's lifeless body slumped against the wall, and Jack's torn-up remains still smoking by the fire pit. Why, Adon? Jonah's voice trembled. Why did you do it? Adon cocked his head to the side, like a predator studying its prey, because I wanted to see if it was real. And now I'm stronger than I've ever been, faster, more powerful. Caitlin spat, her fear slowly giving way to anger. You just murdered two of our friends. That's not power. That's... Before she could finish, Adon lunged toward her, his speed unnatural, inhuman. Caitlin barely had time to scream as he pinned her against the counter, his hand wrapped around her throat. Her eyes bulged as she gasped for air, her hands clawing at his grip. Don't, Brandon yelled, rushing forward to help. But before he could reach them, Adon backhanded him with such force that Brandon flew across the room, crashing into a set of chairs. He lay there, groaning, struggling to get back up. Stop it, I yelled, panic rising in my chest as I looked for anything I could use as a weapon. My hands fumbled over the kitchen counter until I grabbed hold of a knife. I didn't know what good it would do against something like Adon, but I had to try. Jonah moved beside me, his face pale but determined. We have to stop him, Russell. We can't just let him kill us. I nodded, gripping the knife tighter. My hands were shaking, but I took a step forward, hoping my voice sounded braver than I felt. Adon, let her go. You don't have to do this. Adon's cold eyes flickered toward me, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the Adon we used to know, the guy who laughed with us, played football with us. But that glimpse vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the creature that now stood in front of us. You don't get it, do you, Russell? He growled. I do have to do this. This is what I am now. This is what I was always meant to be. With a snarl, he tightened his grip on Caitlin's throat, and I saw her eyes start to roll back. She was losing consciousness. No, I shouted, charging at him with the knife. I swung wildly, aiming for anything I could reach, but Adon was too fast. He shoved Caitlin aside and easily dodged my attack, catching my wrist in his hand and twisting it painfully until I dropped the knife. I cried out in pain, but before I could react, Adon slammed me into the counter, knocking the wind out of me. I gasped for air, my vision blurring from the impact. You're pathetic, Aidan sneered, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. You were always the weak one, Russell. Before he could finish me off, Jonah suddenly charged at him, using his full back strength to tackle Aidan to the ground. They both went crashing down, Aidan snarling in surprise as Jonah struggled to pin him. Caitlin, run, Jonah shouted, trying to keep Aidan's hands pinned to the floor. But it was clear Jonah wouldn't be able to hold him for long. Aidan was too strong, too fast. Caitlin scrambled to her feet, gasping for breath as she staggered toward the door. Brandon was still groaning in pain, but he managed to sit up, his eyes wide with terror as he watched the struggle. We have to get out of here, I rasped, clutching my ribs as I stumbled toward Brandon. We can't fight him, not like this. But Jonah, Brandon began, his voice shaky. He's buying us time, I interrupted, grabbing Brandon by the arm and pulling him toward the front door. We have to go now. Caitlin had already made it outside, her sobs echoing in the night as she sprinted down the driveway. Brandon and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest as we ran as fast as we could. Behind us, I heard Jonah scream a horrible, gut-wrenching sound that told me he hadn't made it. We burst through the front door and into the yard, the moonlight casting long shadows over the grass. Caitlin was ahead of us, running toward the road, but she stopped suddenly, turning back to look at the house with wide, tear-filled eyes. We can't leave him, she sobbed, her voice breaking. We can't leave Jonah. I grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at me. He's gone, Caitlin. We have to keep moving, or we'll be next. Brandon was already ahead, frantically trying to get a signal on his phone. We need to call for help, he muttered, his voice frantic. We need to. Before he could finish, a loud crash echoed from inside the house, followed by a deep, guttural growl. Aidan was coming. Run, I shouted, grabbing Caitlin's hand and pulling her down the road. We ran as fast as we could, not daring to look back. The only sounds were our ragged breaths and the pounding of our feet on the pavement. But even as we fled into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Aidan was still out there, and the next full moon wasn't far away. We would never be safe again. I wasn't sure how to begin this post, or how to share the events that followed. After my last update, life changed in ways I couldn't have predicted, but I should start where I left off. It was a quiet dinner, me, my grandpa, and Justin sitting at the table while Grandma served her usual spread. But despite the food, our thoughts were elsewhere, on David. Even if we didn't speak about him directly, his presence lingered. Grandma, oblivious to the tension, filled the silence with idle conversation, praising Justin for being a good friend. Justin and I exchanged a knowing chuckle, amused by her innocent misunderstanding. Later that night, Justin and I retreated to the guest room. The tension remained. We didn't talk much, just scrolled through our phones, waiting for something to happen. Justin eventually put on TikTok to kill the silence, and I felt myself dozing off. It was the first moment of peace I had felt in a long time. I must have fallen asleep around 8. When I woke up a few hours later, it was almost 1 a.m. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated Justin's sleeping form, his phone still playing videos. The scene reminded me of our childhood sleepovers. Everything seemed almost normal for a moment. Then my phone buzzed. At first, just notifications from games and random posts. But there were also messages from my ex, Jane. That was odd. We'd cut contact after David's attack. But what really threw me was the number. 108 messages, all sent in the span of an hour. I didn't even think. I grabbed a few things, my 6-shooter, my knife, and bolted out of the house. I yelled something back to my grandparents, hoping to wake someone up. The messages from Jane were frantic. 12:59 help. I didn't want to care. She had hurt me, cheated on me, but I couldn't just leave her to die. David had attacked me once, and I couldn't let him do the same to her. Not like this. I drove to Jane's place, my mind racing the entire time. I had a few weapons on me, but it felt inadequate. A rifle in the back seat, hairspray, and Justin's weed, most of it useless for what I was about to face. But there was no turning back now. The neighborhood was eerily quiet as I parked in Jane's driveway. No barking dogs, no lights walking around the house. I saw where David had entered. He'd climbed up to the second story, tearing through a window screen like it was nothing. Hey, fucker. I yelled into the darkness, my voice cracking. Come down and fight me like a man. No response. The house felt abandoned, but I knew better. Jane texted me again, asking if I had a death wish. I told her to mute her phone and FaceTime me. The video came up, showing her hiding in a closet downstairs. From her shaky camera, I could see David pacing near a window, looking out, his movements unnatural. I looked up from my phone and there he was, smiling at me from the window, his mouth stretched impossibly wide, like last time. But now I wasn't just terrified. I was frozen. David wasn't human. He pulled the curtains shut, moving impossibly fast, like he was taunting me. He knew I was there. He was waiting for me. I realized then what this was. David wasn't just a monster. He was a predator, and I was his prey. He'd been watching me, learning, hunting. Every time I'd survived, it was because he let me. But this time he wasn't playing. I had to think fast. I made my way back to my car and grabbed the rifle. Justin had left a few things behind that I thought might come in handy. I checked the gun, knowing it would be no match for him, but needing something. Then headlights. Justin's car pulled up next to mine, and he got out silently, immediately understanding the situation. I quickly filled him in, and we came up with a plan. The goal was simple. Get Jane out, then deal with David. Justin would cause a distraction by breaking a window farthest from where Jane was hiding, giving me the chance to get her out safely. If all went according to plan, we'd take our shot at David literally, but nothing ever goes as planned with David. At 2 a.m., Justin smashed a window, and I slipped inside, moving quietly through the house. I found Jane still in the closet, shaken but alive. I grabbed her arm and pulled her towards the exit, but something felt off about her. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told me she knew something I didn't. There was no time to ask. Gunfire echoed outside, and I rushed back to where Justin had been. But when I rounded the corner, my heart sank. Justin was down, bruised and bloody, and David was standing over him, his skin shifting in ways that defied explanation. I fired 6 shots at him, aiming for his head. 1 hit, maybe, but it wasn't enough. He let out a primal scream, his form becoming more grotesque by the second. I retreated to the bathroom, my heart pounding, and quickly assembled the makeshift bomb I'd planned. Chemicals, aluminum foil, anything I could find to create an explosion. As David pounded on the door, I knew this was my last chance. The door splintered, and I hurled the bomb at him. There was a flash, a deafening bang. When the dust cleared, David was on the ground, his skin burned and peeling. But he wasn't dead. I grabbed the hairspray and lighter, ready to finish him off. But when I pressed the nozzle, nothing. The can was empty. David hit me hard, sending me flying across the room. I barely had time to register what happened next. Jane appeared, Justin's rifle in hand, and fired shot after shot into David. He screamed, his body convulsing as black blood poured from his wounds. But it wasn't enough. He reached her in a split second, and before I could react, Jane was dead. I had one bullet left. David turned to me, his body transforming, his mouth opening wider and wider, teeth lining his entire torso. I aimed, prayed, and fired. The last thing I saw before I passed out was David collapsing. When I woke up, it was over. David was dead. Grandpa told me what happened. The neighbors had called the police, and they found us all half dead, along with an unidentifiable corpse, a mound of flesh and bone that had once been David. Justin survived. But I wasn't as lucky. The doctors said I'd never walk again. The town wrote it off as a bear attack, the last one that would ever be documented. David was gone, but the scars he left behind would never heal. I'm still processing everything. Jane's family came by to say goodbye, and we had a long talk about her, about us. They didn't know the truth. I couldn't bring myself to tell them Justin's made his house handicap accessible, and I might take him up on his offer to stay. Life goes on, I suppose. David may be dead, but the questions he left behind will haunt me forever. There are no such things as ghosts, at least. That's what I've always believed, clinging to logic and reason whenever strange events unfolded. But what happened 2 weeks ago during an ordinary Uber ride has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. This isn't a ghost story in the traditional sense. It's a real story, and the only thing I've altered is my name for the sake of anonymity. Everything else, though, it's all as it happened. Yet, I keep telling myself, there are no such things as ghosts. It was a normal day, like any other. I've been driving for Uber for a couple of years now, ferrying people from one part of town to another, sometimes across the city, other times just a short ride. I enjoy meeting new people, having little snippets of conversation, but for the most part, it's routine. That day, my next pickup was from a quiet residential street. When I arrived, a mother and her young son were waiting at the curb. The boy couldn't have been older than 9, with that innocent energy kids have when they're curious about everything. As they climbed into the car, I greeted them like I always do. "Hi there," I said cheerfully. The boy looked at me with wide eyes and a bright smile, like he'd known me his whole life. "Hi, James," he chirped, full of enthusiasm. It caught me off guard for a second. "Hi," I replied with a laugh. "What's your name?" He grinned at me. "You know my name." I glanced at his mom in the rearview mirror, expecting her to laugh or explain. Instead, she looked just as puzzled as I was. "How do you know his name?" she asked her son. The boy shrugged nonchalantly, looking out the window. "I don't know, but I like him." We all chuckled, chalking it up to the wonders of modern technology. "Maybe he heard me mention your name when I booked the ride," the mom suggested. We nodded, figuring that was the most logical explanation. Kids overhear all sorts of things, right? The ride itself was uneventful, just a short 10-minute trip to a Target across town. But during those minutes, the boy chatted away with me like we were old friends. He was bright, asking questions about my car, my job, and even whether I liked video games. His mom smiled apologetically, mentioning that he often made fast friends with strangers. I didn't mind, though. There was something endearing about him, something familiar. We pulled into the Target parking lot, and I helped them out of the car, wishing them a good day. As they were leaving, I smiled down at the boy and said, "It was nice meeting you." But as he hopped out of the car, he turned to me with a grin and said something that froze me in place. Hey James, I guess none of us ever married Brenda, huh? For a moment I stood there stunned, my hand still gripping the steering wheel. His words hung in the air like a strange echo, lingering far longer than they should have. I blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just said. The mother turned to me, clearly embarrassed, and waved it off. He's got a big imagination, she explained. A bit of a troublemaker, too. I forced a smile and nodded as they walked away, but inside, my mind was racing. How could this boy possibly know that name? Brenda. A name I hadn't thought of in years, decades even. As I drove away, my thoughts spiraled. Brenda wasn't just any random name from my past. When I was about the boy's age, I had a best friend named Eric. We did everything together, from riding bikes to playing video games. We even had a silly little childhood crush on a girl named Brenda who lived down the street. We used to joke about who would marry her when we grew up, as kids do, but Eric had moved away not long after that, and we lost touch. A few years later, when I was in high school, I learned that he had passed away from leukemia. It was a devastating loss, but life moved on, and over time, those memories were buried deep in the back of my mind. Now, here was this boy, a complete stranger, bringing up a name and a memory he had no way of knowing about. It didn't make any sense. How could he know about Brenda, or about Eric for that matter? I replayed the conversation over and over in my head, trying to find some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. My stomach churned as I realized the boy had said none of us ever married Brenda. Not you, but us, as if he was part of that memory, part of that long-lost friendship. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The logical side of my brain kept trying to reassure me. Maybe the boy had overheard his mom talking about something, or maybe he was just exceptionally good at guessing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. As the hours passed, the more I thought about it, the clearer it became in my mind. That boy. He had reminded me of Eric in so many ways. His energy, his curiosity, even the way he spoke to me as if we had known each other forever. Could it really have been him? Was it possible that somehow, in some unexplainable way, Eric had reached out to me through that little boy? I've never believed in ghosts. I've always been a man of reason, of logic. But that day shook me to my core. If it wasn't a ghost, then what was it? I don't have an answer. All I know is that when I look back on that moment, something about it feels undeniably real, as if Eric was there with me, speaking through that boy, reminding me of a friendship that had been cut short too soon. There are no ghosts, I keep telling myself. But now I'm not so sure. Maybe, just maybe, we all come back in one way or another. As this boy, a complete stranger, bringing up a name and a memory he had no way of knowing about. It didn't make any sense. How could he know about Brenda, or about Eric for that matter? I replayed the conversation over and over in my head, trying to find some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. My stomach churned as I realized the boy had said none of us ever married Brenda. Not you, but us, as if he was part of that memory, part of that long-lost friendship. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The logical side of my brain kept trying to reassure me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. As the hours passed, the more I thought about it, the clearer it became in my mind. That boy. He had reminded me of Eric in so many ways. His energy, his curiosity, even the way he spoke to me as if we had known each other forever. Could it really have been him? Was it possible that somehow, in some unexplainable way, Eric had reached out to me through that little boy? I've never believed in ghosts. I've always been a man of reason, of logic. But that day shook me to my core. If it wasn't a ghost, then what was it? I don't have an answer. All I know is that when I look back on that moment, something about it feels undeniably real, as if Eric was there with me, speaking through that boy, reminding me of a friendship that had been cut short too soon. There are no ghosts, I keep telling myself, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe, just maybe, we all come back in one way or another. I remember the first strange incident like it was yesterday. It happened during one of my earliest shifts as a security guard at this massive old building and eerie place after dark. The job was fairly new to me, and I was still learning the ropes. One of the older guards, let's call him Anthony, was in charge of showing me and another new hire, John, how to handle things during the late-night shifts. Anthony had been doing this for years, and his calm demeanor made it seem like nothing could ever rattle him. I felt a bit reassured knowing I was in good hands. We were halfway through the shift, which ran from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. It was around 2:30 a.m. when the three of us decided to take a short break in the office. I remember the flickering fluorescent lights casting strange shadows on the walls as we sat down, the hum of the air conditioning unit barely audible over our conversation. We were enjoying a snack, getting to know each other a little better. That's one of the few perks of this job. If you get along with your coworkers, the long nights don't feel so isolating. But that particular night was different. Out of nowhere, we all heard it, a clear sound echoing through the quiet hallway outside our office. Footsteps, not just the creak of the building settling, or the random noises that come with old structures. These were deliberate, heavy footsteps, like someone was walking toward our office. The three of us exchanged puzzled glances, and without a word, Anthony reached over and pulled up the camera feed for the hallway. Nothing. The hallway was completely empty. John, always the brave one, volunteered to check it out. I'll take a look, he said, sounding far more confident than I felt. As he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the footsteps abruptly stopped. There was only silence. John stood there for a moment, squinting down the long corridor as if expecting to see someone emerge from the darkness. But nothing happened. Then he reached into his pocket, looking as confused as we were. When he came back into the office, he was holding something small and metallic in his hand. It was a keychain. But not just any keychain. It looked like an old set of building keys, the kind we used for the doors in this place. The only problem was, none of us had ever seen those keys before. I just found this in my pocket, John said, holding it up for us to inspect. I swear it wasn't there before. We tested the keys on every lock we could think of. None of them worked. The keys were similar to the ones we used, but slightly off. The shape, the weight, everything was just a little different. It was as if they belonged to an alternate version of this building, a place we didn't have access to. Even now, none of us can explain how they ended up in John's pocket or where they came from. We kept the keychain in the office for a while, but eventually it disappeared just as mysteriously as it had appeared a year later. Another incident happened, and this one I experienced on my own. It was late at night. Like always, the building was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound seem magnified. I was doing my usual round through the school, flashlight in hand, and the only light behind me was from the office. The hallway ahead was dark pitch black except for the faint glow from the exit signs. I was used to walking these halls by then, but that night something felt different. There was an unsettling heaviness in the air. As I neared the end of the hallway, something caught my eye. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or my imagination playing games with me. But then I realized I wasn't imagining it. There was something there, a dark, circular shape hovering just above the floor. It was about the size of a soccer ball, but it was more than just a shadow. It was black on black, blending into the darkness of the hallway, yet somehow standing out. It reminded me of a strange, pulsating mass, like a cell under a microscope. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I wasn't sure why, but some part of me felt that if I shined light on it, it would disappear. Or worse, it might notice me. So instead I did the only thing that seemed reasonable in the moment. I reached out to touch it. As soon as my fingers brushed against the surface, if you can even call it, that I felt an intense jolt, like I had just stuck my hand into a live electrical socket. The shock shot up my arm, and I yanked my hand back, cursing under my breath. My skin tingled, but I wasn't burned or injured. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had been. The strange circular mass had vanished, leaving me alone in the hallway with nothing but the echo of my own heartbeat. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who would believe me? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that everything strange I had experienced had happened in this same hallway. The footsteps, the keys, the shadowy mass. It was as if the building itself was trying to tell us something, or maybe warn us about what lingered in the darkness. Even now, I don't have an explanation. I've been doing this job long enough to know that not everything has a neat answer. Sometimes things happen that defy logic, that make you question what's real. All I know is I'll never look at those hallways the same way again. If there's something watching us, playing tricks on us. I'm not sure I want to find out what it is. I'm just telling you what I went through. Let me know what you guys think. I don't like talking about this much. It brings back memories that still haunt me. But here's my story. It all started when I was 9 years old. My family moved out of a small apartment in Brisbane and into an old, cheap house on a piece of land with a big backyard. My dad thought it was a fixer-upper, something he could handle. The landlord lived in another state, making communication hard. From the moment we stepped inside, there were strange signs. The first thing we noticed was a large, filthy rug in the kitchen, stained with what looked like old blood. We tossed it immediately. Then we found horseshoes nailed upside down on trees around the property, and one in the kitchen. It felt creepy, so we took them down too, not realizing that, as we later discovered, upside-down horseshoes are meant to ward off negative energy. In hindsight, maybe we should have left them up, because after that, bad luck seemed to follow us. At first, the house was just old and eerie, but I was a tomboy and loved playing outside. One day, I started noticing things buried under the dirt, pieces of clothing, shoes, and sometimes scraps of fabric sticking out. My mom and I dug them up, but they were always women's or children's clothes. My dad, the skeptic, brushed it off. Even when I found a bone under the house, he insisted it was from cattle. My mom wanted to report it to the police, but my dad shut the idea down. That's when the paranormal activity started. My dad worked nights, so it was just my mom and me at home. One evening, my mom was using our old family computer, and I stood behind her, talking. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I turned around, expecting my dad, but no one was there. It felt so real that I called out for him, but he hadn't come home yet. Another night, I was sleeping in my room, which was actually an old sunroom, when I woke up to the sound of my Furby making noise. Furbies had motion sensors and would only talk when triggered. My bed was too far from it to activate the sensor, and when I got up to switch it off, the switch was already in the off position. Then the nightmares began. Every single night, I had the same dream. I was tied to an old springy bed in my own room, but the space was different. It was like another time. No electricity, no furniture except for a candle on a table beside me. I would struggle to get free, but I never could. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, sometimes with 3 scratches on my stomach. Later, I found out that 3 claw marks are a common sign of a demonic presence. I was about 10 or 11 years old by then, and the nightmares were wearing me down. I was scared to sleep in my room and started sleeping on a blow-up mattress in my parents' room. The nightmares slowed down, but I began sleepwalking. My parents told me that I would sit up in the middle of the night, screaming and pointing at their bedroom window, yelling for them to shut the window and don't let him in. My mom was terrified, but my dad just brushed it off as me going through a phase. As time passed, things got worse. My mom started hearing footsteps when she was home alone at night, and a ceiling fan would turn on by itself, even when the switch was off. But the worst was when my baby brother, who had just started walking, suddenly fell ill. Out of nowhere, he couldn't walk anymore. He stopped eating, sleeping, and he seemed completely paralyzed. We took him to multiple doctors, but no one could figure out what was wrong. One doctor even accused him of faking it, despite the fact that he couldn't move his spine. Eventually, a specialist found a rare cyst in his spine that was on the verge of bursting and paralyzing him permanently. Luckily, it was treated in time, but that period was hell for my family, and it didn't stop there. One morning, after we had built a chicken coop in the yard, we woke up to find the coop wide open and all the chickens gone. Their heads were neatly lined up in a row in the backyard, but their bodies were missing. That was the last straw for my dad. He called the police, but no suspects were ever found. It was around this time that I learned that decapitated chickens are sometimes used in dark rituals. We couldn't afford to leave right away, but when we finally did, the nightmares stopped. Now, more than 10 years later, the house still stands, abandoned and overgrown. Whenever I drive past it, I feel drawn to it, though I'd never set foot inside again. The trauma I experienced there is something I'll carry with me forever. In 2021, after graduating high school, I am 18, decided to take a gap year. The pandemic had been rough, and I was overwhelmed with online classes. On top of that, my godfather passed away due to medical malpractice, and I was dealing with a lot of grief. My older brother, M25, who was working at Paco at the time, came across an elderly woman who needed a dog sitter. Given that I had experience with dogs, he helped me land an interview. I should have walked out the moment she said she'd only pay me $2 an hour bi-weekly because she could pay anyone $10 an hour to do the job. Still, being young and not knowing my worth, I reluctantly accepted. It was a 12-hour day job, 6 days a week. I couldn't help but think about how much I could have earned if I'd had more confidence in myself. As the interview went on, she mentioned an ex-roommate who she'd kicked out after a heated argument. She told me that under no circumstances should I ever let anyone into the house, especially him. She warned me to lock the door the moment I arrived and only open it for her. The warning gave me chills, but my instinct to help kicked in, and I convinced myself that this lonely old lady needed someone to rely on. At first, the job was great. I'd wake up early, head over to her giant house, and take care of the dogs, which mostly involved walking them twice a day and feeding them boiled chicken that I had to reheat in a pot daily. For the rest of the day, I had free reign of her 3,000-square-foot home, complete with 3 bedrooms, and no one bothered me for hours. It seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. But then things started to go wrong. After 2 or 3 months, I couldn't shake the lingering fear about her ex-roommate. One day, when I came in for my shift, everything felt normal at first, but I had this gut feeling that I shouldn't take the dogs outside just yet. I'm physically disabled, so managing the dogs and yard was tiring enough. But this felt different, like a warning. Then it happened. Tap, tap, tap at the front door. I froze. The mail carrier never knocked, so this was unusual. I shouted, "Leave the box at the door, please." But my heart sank when I heard a voice reply, "Hello, can you let me in?" Peeking through the window, I saw him. A tall, lanky man with an odd toupee and icy blue eyes, staring straight at me. He knocked again, tap, 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 and said, "I'm not going to hurt you, please. I just have a package." I told him I didn't know him and to go away, but he stayed put. That's when he dropped the bombshell. "My friend is your boss." My heart raced. This was the exact situation the old lady had warned me about. He kept insisting that he needed to come inside. He even started walking around the house toward the back, looking for another way in. I yelled at him, threatening to call 911 if he didn't stop. His response, a calm chuckle. "Whoa there. It's all right, buddy," he said. "I just need my Mipolo. It's in the other room. Only I know where it is." I tried reasoning with him, but nothing worked, so I called my boss. When she finally answered, her response was less than helpful. She told me not to let him in and to be cautious, but she also tried to downplay the danger, claiming he was harmless. She couldn't leave work until 3 p.m. for hours away, so I had no choice but to figure something out. I called my dad next. He wasn't far, and thank God for that. When he arrived, he didn't hesitate to confront the man. My dad squared up with him, yelling, "Back the F asterisk 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 up. Dude, I will beat your asterisk asterisk." Finally, the man took the hint and slowly backed away, mumbling something about coming back for his Mipolo before running off. At that point, I left the house, grateful that no one has hurt me, my dad, or the dogs. Unfortunately, that wasn't the last of my time working for that woman, but that's a story for another time. When I was 7, my dad and stepmom were looking for a new house to rent. One day, they took my sister and me along to check out a potential place. As we pulled up, I noticed a tree swing in the front yard with a little girl around my age, about 7, swinging on it. She had pigtails and was wearing an overall skirt with a bib front and straps over her shoulders, despite the cold. She didn't say a word, just watched us as we got out of the car. Oddly, my dad, stepmom, and sister didn't seem to notice her, so I said hi. Our eyes met, and she stopped swinging. She continued staring at me as we walked down the sidewalk toward the house. I asked my stepmom why we were there, and she casually replied, "We're going to rent this house." Confused, I told her that we couldn't because someone already lived there. She looked at me and said, "No one lives here. It's our house now." I glanced back at the girl, still seeing her out of the corner of my eye. But when we reached the porch and I looked through the large window by the front door, the swing was empty. It was still moving, though swaying back and forth in long arcs like someone was still on it. But the yard was empty, no sign of the girl, no place to hide. That was just the beginning of my experiences in that house. Not long after we moved in, I started hearing heavy footsteps, the kind a tall man wearing heavy boots might make. My dad was a welder, and his steel-toed boots made similar sounds. The footsteps would come from the front door, move through the kitchen, behind the couch where we all sat, and end in the first bedroom, the one my sister and I shared. The room was always cold, and my stepmom kept the door closed to keep the house warm. But later, I found out she was just as creeped out by the room as I was. Sometimes the footsteps would stop at the closed door. Other times the door would open on its own, or it would open and then shut again. I hated the door being closed and refused to sleep in the room if it was. My dad didn't like leaving it open because it was right off the living room, and he liked to watch TV late at night. My sister and dad didn't seem to hear the footsteps, but I knew my stepmom did. I could see her tense up and follow the sound with her eyes as it passed behind the couch. I always sat in the armchair opposite the couch, even though I had to watch the TV at an angle. One night, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps coming from the front door. I assumed it was my dad checking on us, as he often did after coming home late. But this time the steps didn't leave after a few seconds. They stopped at the foot of my bed. The air in the room felt heavy with anger. I could hear the person breathing short, hard breaths like they were getting angrier by the second. Terrified, I rolled onto my back, expecting to see my dad standing there, but it wasn't him. Instead, a tall man with broad shoulders stood at the foot of my bed. He wore a blue checkered work shirt and dirty jeans. His face, however, was a black mass of scribbles, like a child had angrily drawn over where his face should have been. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in fear. I sat up to jump out of bed, but as soon as I moved, the man crawled onto the bed, hovering over me with his arms and legs on either side of me. His faceless head loomed closer. I pulled the blankets over my head and laid back down, repeating to myself that he couldn't hurt me. But then I felt the weight of him pressing down on me, heavier and heavier. The blanket was pushed into my face, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to move, but was trapped under his crushing weight. Finally, I managed to turn my head and scream. My stepmom later told me it was the most blood-curdling scream she had ever heard. She rushed into the room and turned on the light, but she couldn't see me in the bed. She said it looked like I had been pressed flat into the mattress. My sister, a deep sleeper, was lying next to me, completely undisturbed. My stepmom jumped onto the bed, yelling, "Let her go." She swore she felt the weight lift off me as I finally rose from the mattress. I was hysterical, crying and yelling at her for telling me that the spirits couldn't hurt me. All she could do was apologize, saying over and over, "I know, I'm sorry." When my dad came in, furious about being woken up, my stepmom snapped at him, saying she had told him so. She wanted to move out immediately, but my dad refused. He paid the bills, so we had no choice but to stay. After that, I refused to sleep in that room again. My stepmom moved the couch and TV, and my sister and I slept on the floor in the living room. We left the TV on all night to feel safe. Even though I still heard the heavy footsteps going into the bedroom, the faceless man never appeared again. I never stepped foot in that room again. Though I didn't see the man again, I did encounter other spirits in the house to little kids. After the incident with the faceless man, my sister and I slept on the floor in the living room. I used to roll balls from the living room into the dining room for our cats to chase. Sometimes the ball would get stuck under the kitchen cabinets, and I'd have to go fetch it. One day, while playing alone, I heard whispering in the kitchen. After the ball got stuck, the cats were crouched in the dining room, staring into the kitchen. their tails twitching like they were waiting for something. The whispering continued, and I froze. Then I heard a little girl's voice say, "Don't, you'll make him mad." Suddenly, the ball bounced out of the kitchen on its own, rolling back into the living room. As I watched it roll, I saw a little boy's face peek around the wall from the kitchen. He had light-colored hair, freckles, and looked washed out, like he was faded. I waved at him, and he waved back shyly, before disappearing. When I heard the heavy footsteps again, I told my stepmom what had happened, and she wasn't surprised. She told me to be kind to them. They were just kids like me, stuck in that house with the terrible man. When we finally moved, she asked me to invite the kids to come with us. I didn't think anything would happen, but I am pretty sure one of them, the little boy, did follow us to our new house. When I was 19, long after leaving the house I once called hell, my life crossed paths with another place that, in its own quiet way, left me deeply unsettled. My parents had moved into a new house, this time with a man named Josh. He wasn't unstable, but had a troubled history. His name is all I remember, and since he's no longer with us, I don't mind sharing that small detail. The house was strange, marked by a silence that seemed unnatural. It was almost as if no matter what noise was happening, whether a fan was running or my younger siblings were playing, there was always a suffocating stillness in the air. It felt wrong, but at first I welcomed the quiet, thinking nothing of it. When I arrived that winter, my brother wasted no time in letting me know that the house was haunted. "This house is haunted with something," he said flatly. I wasn't too concerned. After living in that house from hell, I thought I'd seen it all. "Okay, what's been going on?" I asked. Dada and my other brother, B, filled me in on the strange occurrences. They told me about tapping noises in the walls, the bedroom door that always managed to be open when they turned their backs or woke up, even when no one else was home except for Josh. It sounded bizarre, and they even mentioned Josh's odd behavior, his obsession with sharpening knives, and his overall strangeness. He wasn't harmful, just eccentric. I wasn't sure if I believed everything they were telling me until I saw it for myself. I'd planned to sleep in a large closet in the downstairs room, but that room, like the rest of the house, seemed to have a life of its own. The door never stayed closed. It wasn't that it didn't latch properly, it did. But somehow it would open on its own. I saw it happen twice while I was there. That door refused to stay shut, as if something unseen kept pushing it open. Dada and B also warned me about the basement. They said it always felt like someone was watching from outside the basement window, and that it was freezing down there, even accounting for the winter cold. The footsteps, hearing someone walking up the basement stairs, became a constant. I wasn't keen on investigating that area, so after dealing with the door for a couple of days, I decided to move upstairs. But upstairs didn't feel much safer. I often heard creaks on the stairs at night, and while that might seem like the house settling, it was too frequent, too intentional. I stayed at that house over 20 times, and I heard those stairs creak more often than I can count. One night, I experienced something that still gives me chills to this day. I was lying in bed, the lights on, feeling myself drift off to sleep. But I didn't fully fall asleep. Instead, it felt like I had entered a different reality, a sleep paralysis nightmare. One moment the room was lit, and the next, it was plunged into darkness. But it wasn't just that. The layout of the room felt off, as if the very structure of the space had changed. I couldn't move. The silence around me became deafening, so loud that it felt like a rumble in my ears, getting louder and louder. There was something in the room with me. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was standing near the door, watching. It felt like it was moving closer as the rumbling grew louder in my head. And then, just as quickly as the darkness had fallen, the lights flicked back on. I snapped out of it, not groggy or disoriented like I usually am when waking. No, this time I was wide awake, staring blankly at the sunlight streaming through the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me, watching, lurking in the dark. I tried to brush it off, but deep down I knew there was something wrong with that house. On another day, I was heading down to the basement, and a stray cat suddenly darted past me, running up the stairs. My parents had mentioned the stray cat sneaking in a lot, so I wasn't surprised, but what happened next sent shivers down my spine. As I turned back toward the basement, I saw a black blur at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't the cat, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. Yeah, I'm all right. No basement for me, I muttered to myself. Hurrying back upstairs, as for Josh, he seemed to grow more distant each time I visited. He wasn't the same man he had been when we first met. My parents told me that before they moved out, Josh had said he was going to miss everyone being there. He didn't want to be left alone in that house, and I couldn't blame him. The silence, the constant feeling of being watched, and the strange happenings had taken their toll on him. Josh had his demons. Sure, he had shot up heroin using his own urine, but he had survived that. He was a good man, misunderstood, and perhaps haunted by more than just the physical world. When my parents finally moved out, Josh tried to pay my dad to stay with him. He didn't want to be alone in that house. I think he knew, just as we did, that there was something wrong with that place. But no one wanted to stay, not even Josh. It wasn't long after they left that Josh passed away. He died a couple of weeks later, and though I'll never know for sure, I can't help but feel that house had a hand in it. The house drained him just like it had drained all of us during the short time we were there. That house was far from normal. Its silence was a warning, and its secrets were buried deep. But I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't just a house. It was something much darker, much more sinister. It wasn't a home. It was a trap, and it had claimed its final victim. I was 10 years old, and it was summer break. Our family had just finished lunch, and my stepdad had already left for work. My brother and I were fighting over what to watch on TV. I wanted cartoons, and he wanted to watch a movie. After some back and forth, my mom, frustrated with the arguing, sent us to our rooms to clean. Our mobile home in the Ohio countryside was small, and you could always tell who was walking through the house by the sound of their footsteps. My brother's room was on one end of the trailer, and mine was right next to it, while my mom and stepdad's room was all the way at the opposite end of the house. I started cleaning my room, but like any 10-year-old, I got distracted. I found a Barbie doll I thought I had left at my biological dad's house, but it had just been lost in the clutter of my own room. I was soon lost in playing with the doll, pretending she was a fashionista. I'm not sure how much time passed, maybe 15 minutes, but I was sitting on the floor a few feet away from my toy chest and my bedroom door when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Startled, I jumped, immediately thinking it was my brother trying to scare me, but there had been no sound of footsteps. My mom always stopped through the house, and I would have heard my brother if he was walking around. He wasn't exactly the quiet type. I felt uneasy before even looking up, as though something in me knew this wasn't my brother. When I finally turned to see who was there, I froze. Standing in front of my bedroom door was a man. He was dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in the late 80s or early 90s, and he looked eerily like my biological father. The resemblance was uncanny if my dad had sported a mullet and a mustache. But I knew it couldn't be him. My dad lived an hour away, and it wasn't his weekend visit. Besides, my bio-dad always shaved his head, and he wouldn't just show up unannounced. That wasn't even the scariest part. What made my blood run cold was that this man, who looked so much like my dad, was holding his own decapitated head in his right hand. He held it up like some kind of twisted lantern, using his severed head to light up the room. His face was frozen in a cruel, twisted smile, even though his head wasn't attached to his body. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I stared at him in complete shock, my body frozen, unable to move or even scream. The Barbie doll was still in my hand, but I couldn't lift it or do anything except gape at this horrifying figure. I must have stared at him for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only 10 seconds. Finally, I squeezed my eyes shut as tight as I could, whispering to myself that he wasn't real. When I opened my eyes again, he was gone. I didn't move for what felt like hours, though it was only a few minutes. I just sat there, staring at the spot where he had stood, waiting for him to reappear. When my mom came to check on us, she noticed I was acting strange. I was still sitting there, blankly staring at the empty doorway, my face completely drained of emotion. She asked me if I was okay, but I brushed it off, not wanting to tell her what had happened. I never saw that man again, but I thought about that moment every week since. To this day, I wonder if it was a ghost I saw. It's hands down the scariest thing I've ever experienced. Even though it's been years, I still can't shake the memory of that man standing in my doorway, his head in his hand, smiling at me like it was all a sick joke. For context, I am currently 19 years old, but this story takes place when I was much younger, between the ages of 6 and 10. To clarify, I am 80% skeptical when it comes to other people's paranormal experiences. However, when it comes to my own encounters, I am a 100% believer. This is one of those experiences, and to this day, I have no other explanation for what happened. I was probably around 6 to 8 years old at the time, judging by my bedroom's layout, which plays an important role in the story. Please bear with me as I explain the setting. As you walk into the hallway, mine was the first room on the left. Upon entering, to the right, there was a straight wall, no windows or indentations. Directly in front of you was the back wall with a window. On the left side of the room was another wall, but just as you stood at the doorway and looked to the left, there was a small bump out where my closet was located. The bump out extended roughly a meter, maybe a little less. My bed was on the left wall after the bump out, positioned in the middle of the room, with only the headboard touching the wall. As a kid and even to this day, I tend to move around a lot in my sleep. I would frequently wake up cold because I had kicked the blankets off and would have to reach out to pull them back on. This night was no different. I had woken up cold, reached to my right to grab my blankets, and for some reason, I felt an intense urge to look at my door. What I saw froze me in place. Standing there, peeking around the corner of my door, was the shadowy figure of a kid. It was no taller than I was at the time, and I could distinctly make out the shape of its head, shoulder, and a hand gripping the doorframe. It was just a black silhouette, but I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. Now, it's worth mentioning that I have two brothers, one older and one younger, but they weren't home that night. They were staying with my dad at my grandmother's house. It was just my mom and me at home, so there was no explanation for who or what I was seeing. Despite my fear, I didn't scream. I didn't call out for my mom. I remember physically forcing myself to turn away and lie back down. It felt like my body weighed a ton, but eventually I managed to face away from the door, willing myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I had almost forgotten about it, like it had been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. What makes it worse is that this wasn't a one-time event. I saw that same shadowy figure, what I now call the boy, more than once after that. It was never as clear as that first night, but I would catch glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye. It was always like walking past a room and thinking you see something, but when you step back to look again, there's nothing there. After we moved out of that house in 2018, the sightings stopped. I haven't seen the boy or any other shadow figures since. Well, except for one strange incident about a month ago, but that's another story for another time. If anyone has theories about what could have happened or explanations to debunk this, I'm open to hearing them. I've replayed this event in my head countless times, and I still don't have an answer. And if anyone decides to share this on one of those story channels, let me know. Thank you for reading. This experience takes place around 2012 or 2013 at my grandparents' house. I'm 22 now, so I was about 12 or 13 at the time. I've always had an uneasy feeling about their place, but I could never fully explain why. One thing that definitely added to the eerie atmosphere was my grandma's room, which was full of dolls. Now, I've never seen Chucky or anything like that, but those dolls, I couldn't stand them. I avoided that room like the plague. That's why I always opted to sleep in the living room whenever I stayed over. It was summer vacation, so naturally I was staying up late, watching YouTube and binge watching TV on demand. I had this usual routine of lounging in my grandparents' recliner until I eventually got tired. As the night went on and my eyelids grew heavy, I started leaning my head back in the recliner, letting sleep slowly take over. That's when I saw her. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a woman walk into the kitchen. She was big, dressed in white, or maybe it was some sort of gown. It was all so quick and blurry. Now, keep in mind, it was just me and my grandparents in the house that night, and they had long since gone to bed. Startled, I quickly sat up, trying to shake the sleepiness away and get a clearer look. But just as I raised my head, I felt something trickling down my nose. At first, I thought it was snot. It's pretty common when you're leaning back like that. But when I wiped it away, my hand came back covered in red blood. I had a sudden nosebleed. Panicking a bit, I rushed to the bathroom to try to stop it before it got all over the place. I can't explain it, but the timing of that nosebleed felt weird. I had been perfectly fine up until the moment I thought I saw that woman. And to this day, I can't help but wonder if the two were somehow connected. This is just one of a handful of strange things that have happened to me, but it still stands out in my mind. I'd love to hear what you all, especially those in the paranormal community, think about this. Could it just be a coincidence, or was there something more to it? The memory of that night has stuck with me throughout my life, and even now, 23 years old, I remember it vividly as if it just happened. The experience took place when I was in middle school, and it still haunts me to this day. I lived in the same house from 4th grade all the way until I graduated high school. My room had a loft bed, and I was fortunate enough to have the room with the walk-in closet, mostly because I had more clothes than my sister. This closet had a light switch outside and a lock on the inside. I don't really remember why I felt the need to lock it, but I was adamant about it. Every night, I made sure that the closet door was firmly shut before going to bed. One night I woke up suddenly. I found myself lying on my back, which was odd since I had always been a stomach sleeper. There was this strange compulsion to sit up, like something was pulling at me. Still groggy, I turned to look over the edge of my loft bed at the closet, and my heart nearly stopped. The closet door, which I always locked before bed, was wide open. The light inside was on, but all my clothes and belongings were gone. It was empty, except for a few pieces of clothing strewn on the floor, leading out of the closet like a trail dot. As I stared, trying to process what was happening, a shadow started to form on the carpet just below the closet's threshold. Slowly, this dark mass began to rise from the ground. At first, it was just a formless shadow, but then it started to take shape. Grooves appeared, hollow eye sockets, sharp teeth. It was a skull, but not just any skull. As it rose higher, I realized it was the head of a deer, bleach white and terrifying. The figure's body was cloaked in a dark, hooded robe that seemed to melt into the ground and merge with its shadow. I was frozen, staring at this hooded figure, completely unable to move or scream. My mind was in a trance, unable to fully comprehend the horror of what was standing in front of me. The figure had no eyes, only empty voids where they should have been, but I knew it was staring directly at me. We locked eyes, if you can call it that, and time seemed to stretch. Then something even more unsettling happened. As if controlled by an invisible force, I slowly nodded my head. I had no control over the movement. It was like my body was acting without my permission, almost as if acknowledging my gesture. The figure nodded back at me. Then, just as it had risen, it began to descend back into the shadow. I watched in numb disbelief as it melted back into the floor, the darkness fading away until there was nothing left. Only then did I feel the strange pull on my body release, and I fell back onto my bed, instantly slipping into sleep. When I woke up the next morning, everything was normal again. The closet door was closed, the light was off, and my clothes were all where they should be. But the vivid memory of what had happened during the night stuck with me. It wasn't a dream. I knew it wasn't a dream. I felt myself move. I was sitting up, I was awake, and I was in control except for that moment when I nodded against my will. I've never experienced anything like it since. No shadow figures, no eerie encounters. But that one night left its mark on me, and I try not to think about it too often. I've always been a vivid dreamer, and my dreams sometimes feel so real that I have to take a moment after waking up to remind myself where I am. But this was different. I know the difference between dreaming and being awake, and that night I was definitely awake. There was something in that room with me, and even though I've tried to brush it off, I can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just a trick of the mind. Something else was there, watching me. My name is Nevi, and I'm 20 years old. After dealing with some personal issues, I've recently moved back into my parents' house in North Carolina. Now, if you know anything about this state, you'll know it's one of the most haunted places in the U.S., and our house seems to fit that reputation. My parents live in an eerie, old, 8-bedroom house with a basement. Here's where it gets unsettling. The person who lived here before was a doctor. One person. Why would a single doctor need a massive house with 8 rooms? What was really going on here? As if that wasn't strange enough, the house was equipped with slide locks on the outside of the doors. We've taken them off now, but the holes are still there, a constant reminder of whatever history this house holds. Why would someone lock people inside their rooms? But let me get to the ghosts. I've heard so many creepy stories from my siblings, each one more unnerving than the last. My brother, Shaden17M, has the scariest story so far. The basement of our house has a door that leads outside, down a set of stairs. The stairwell is almost like walking into the ground with a roof at ground level above you. One night, Shaden was standing down there, catching some air, when he heard two distinct footsteps on top of the roof above him. He rushed to look, thinking it was one of us or maybe an animal, but no one was there. Then there's Anne-Marie 15F, my younger sister. Her window overlooks that same stairwell where Shaden heard the footsteps. We also have a shed in our backyard, and it's got a motion sensor light. The thing is, that light goes off constantly at night, even when nothing's out there. Anne-Marie has heard footsteps walking around the house late at night, adding to the unsettling feeling that someone or something is always lurking around our home. Not my experience. It's no less terrifying. There have been nights when I've heard full-on whispering in my room, soft but clear voices that seem to come from nowhere. One night I heard something running up the stairs toward me. It wasn't human, it was too fast and too heavy. Even my cat, who's usually unbothered by anything, got spooked and ran off. And now, as I write this, I feel like someone is watching me. My little brother, Adnija10M, has his own share of nightmares, and they seem to be tied directly to the house. He's had vivid, terrifying dreams where our stepmom 35F is sitting in the corner of his room, staring at the ceiling and calling his name in a voice that doesn't sound like hers. This has shaken him up so badly that he wakes up in a panic. Even my stepmom herself has had an encounter. She once woke up in the middle of the night to see an apparition standing at the end of her bed. The next night, she dreamt that a ghost came to her, telling her it wasn't here to hurt us. But what does that really mean? Can we trust it? Oh, and I almost forgot another chilling detail. Shaden, my 17-year-old brother, was playing hide and seek with our younger siblings when he heard someone knock on the door. He went to the front door, peeked through the peephole, and saw someone walking down the steps, someone he didn't recognize. Thinking it was our dad, he ran outside and said, "I saw you. You can't trick me." But our dad was sitting in the same spot the whole time, claiming he hadn't moved an inch. From the angle of the person's footsteps, my dad would have seen them too, but he didn't. So here we are, living in this house that feels like it's alive with something. I don't know what to make of it. The whispers, the footsteps, the eerie sightings, everything about this place feels off. Even now, there's this constant tension in the air, as if we're being watched, followed, or maybe even haunted by whatever lingers here. I thought you guys in the paranormal community might find this story interesting. What do you think we're dealing with? Could there be something darker at play in this old house? Years ago, when I was 19, I worked as a laundry aide and housekeeper in a nursing home. It was my first real job, and even now, the things I experienced still send shivers down my spine. This particular nursing home wasn't just unsettling, it was downright eerie. Most of the patients were extremely dependent, suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. They would cry out in confusion or sadness, and the place felt heavy with illness. I knew it wasn't their fault, but being young and inexperienced, I couldn't help feeling uneasy every day I worked there. One patient, though, unnerved me the most. She was an older woman, always alone in her room, despite having all these nice things around her. I never saw anyone visit her, Her room was filled with personal belongings, but the air in there felt cold, almost hostile. I tried to be friendly at first, making small talk when I came to clean or deliver her laundry, but she always either ignored me or glared at me. Eventually, I stopped trying. One day, as I walked into her room to clean, I heard her speaking. At first, I assumed she was on the phone, or maybe a nurse had come to check on her. But when I stepped inside, I saw she was alone, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her lips were moving, though as if she was in the middle of a conversation. I gave her a polite smile, but she only glanced at me before looking back up. I started cleaning, trying to mind my own business, but her talking didn't stop. In fact, it got more intense, like she was having a real conversation with someone. Finally, I turned around and asked, "Were you talking to me, Miss underscore underscore underscore?" She didn't respond. She just stared at the ceiling, her face twisted in a furious expression. I quickly apologized, feeling embarrassed and a little confused. I turned back around and kept cleaning, trying to shake the weird vibe. Then she spoke again, and this time I heard her words clearly. "Sorry about her. No, I don't want you to kill her." My body froze. My heart pounded in my chest as chills ran down my spine. Did I hear that right? I didn't move, just stood there, hoping I'd misunderstood her. She continued, her voice calm and conversational. "Because if you do, the nurses will be upset, and everyone will make a big fuss, and I don't feel like dealing with that right now." I couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. I just wanted to get out of there. My hands moved on autopilot as I finished cleaning as fast as I could. I didn't look at her again, didn't try to make any sense of it. I just bolted out of her room the moment I was done. I ran straight to my supervisor, heart racing, and told her everything, barely holding back tears. But she didn't believe me. She thought I was making up some story just to leave early. She told me to calm down and take a break. That break did nothing to help. From that day on, I couldn't spend more than a couple of minutes in the woman's room without feeling the suffocating weight of fear. And every time I did have to clean her room, she would always be talking to someone I couldn't see, carrying on those strange, eerie conversations. I never interrupted her again. I still don't know who she was talking to, and I never asked, but the memory of that day still haunts me. This incident happened nearly 20 years ago, when I was 15, living with my grandmother and uncle. Even now, I can't explain it. It's one of those memories that sticks with you, knowing at the back of your mind, always making you wonder what was real and what was and single quotes tita. To give you some context, my grandparents had built their house together with their son, my uncle. My grandparents lived on the ground floor, and my uncle lived upstairs. They built the place with their bare hands, working long hours on top of my uncle's 9-to-5 job. It was an intense period of constant work for nearly 2 years. That kind of relentless grind took a toll on my uncle, and eventually something snapped. He started acting ... off. He quit his job, saying everyone there was watching him. He became obsessed with safety, no open windows, all doors locked, because he was convinced gas could somehow enter the rooms and catch fire. It was all irrational, but it dominated his life. I lived with them during this time, and while my uncle never hurt me, his behavior freaked me out regularly. He had this unsettling habit of standing silently in the dark hallway in the middle of the night. Imagine watching TV late at night, thinking everyone's asleep, only to turn off the TV, open the door, and be confronted by him standing there. No sound, no warning, just him, staring. In his mind, he was just keeping watch, but for me, It was terrifying. Then there were the nights when he'd suddenly burst into my room, almost as if he thought something was happening to me. It wasn't a gentle knock or a casual check. He'd rush in, unannounced, and it always set my heart racing. Now that you know a bit about him, here's what happened on one of those terrifying nights. I had fallen asleep like any other night. It was peaceful enough, but sometime in the middle of the night I suddenly woke up. There hadn't been any noise or disturbance, but I was wide awake, terrified. My heart was racing, and I had this intense feeling of dread. My breathing was loud, so I tried to control it, listening for any sounds that might explain why I was so scared. At first, everything was silent. I stayed there for a few minutes, convincing myself that it was just a nightmare that I couldn't remember. But then I heard the creak of the third step from the top of the stairway. I knew that creak well because it always sounded whenever someone went up or down the stairs. Naturally, I thought it must be my uncle, but then the footsteps started, only they didn't sound like his. They were too fast, like someone was sprinting down the hallway, heading straight for my door. The pounding footsteps grew louder and louder, and then they stopped. Suddenly, right outside my door, I was frozen. My body refused to move. I couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe properly. I was convinced my uncle was standing just outside my room, but something didn't feel right. The steps didn't sound like his. I knew the sound of his footsteps. They were slower, more deliberate. These were fast, almost frantic, and the way they came to such a sudden halt, it was unnatural. No one could sprint like that and stop so abruptly without crashing into the door. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for something to happen, for him to burst into the room like he had so many times before. But nothing. No more steps, no movement, no sound, just silence. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, though I don't know how. The next morning, everything was normal, nothing out of place. No one else seemed to have heard anything. But I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps or the feeling that someone or something was right outside my door that night. To this day, I still don't know what it was. My uncle. Maybe a vivid, lucid dream, possibly. But whatever it was, the memory of those footsteps and the terror they brought still haunts me. This is not my personal story, but rather one my dad experienced years ago before he and my mom got married. At the time, they were living in different states due to work, and my dad was in Arizona, while my mom was somewhere else. One night, my dad had to drive a long distance through the desert to drop my mom off at the airport. And what happened that night has left him with an unsettling memory. It was late at night when my dad dropped her off, and as he started driving back home, the road was completely empty. It was one of those roads that cut through the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the desert around him, and the only light coming from his car's headlights. The darkness felt oppressive, like it swallowed everything outside the reach of the headlights. As my dad was driving, he suddenly noticed something lying in the middle of his side of the road. He slowed down, curious, but also cautious. From inside his car, he saw what he thought was a large, dead animal, most likely a deer. He was about to drive around it when something horrifying happened. The animal's head shot up and turned toward him. It wasn't just that it looked at him, though. My dad said that he saw the skin of the animal move, like something was inside it, shifting unnaturally. He couldn't make out exactly what it was, but it looked like the shape of a person inside the animal's body. Without hesitation, my dad muttered, F*** this, and sped off around the animal. But as he drove away, the terror wasn't over. He felt and heard something running alongside his car, keeping pace with him even as he sped down the empty road. The sense of danger became overwhelming, and he could feel the panic rising in his chest. He told me that as he was racing down the road, he silently began praying, hoping whatever was chasing him would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the sensation of being followed stopped. The sound of running feet disappeared, and my dad felt like he had finally shaken off whatever was after him. When he recounted this story to me, he insisted that it wasn't supernatural, but he couldn't explain what he had seen or felt. All he knew was that the fear he experienced was real, and he never drove down that road in the dark again. Now, I'm curious if anyone out there might have an idea of what my dad encountered. Could it have been something supernatural, or was it some kind of bizarre desert phenomenon? I'd love to hear any theories or explanations anyone might have. Last night, on November 15th, 2023, something happened that shook me to my core. It was around 3:30 in the morning, and I was chilling on my couch, watching grown-ups. Just a regular night, or so I thought. Out of nowhere, I heard someone messing with my doorknob. My heart dropped. I had a knife stashed in my TV drawer for this exact reason, so I grabbed it immediately. My hand was trembling, but I bolted upstairs, terrified because my door has glass that could easily be shattered. I live in a low-income area, and security isn't exactly a thing around here. No cameras, no nothing. My place is a small, 2-story loft with no door to barricade upstairs, just an open area. As I stood there, trying to keep calm, I dialed 911. I whispered as loudly as I could, telling them someone was trying to break in. The locks were still being messed with, and I could hear it like a relentless rattling that wouldn't stop. The sound has been playing over and over in my head ever since. At that point, I didn't know if the person was trying to pick the lock or just scaring me by jiggling the doorknob. But then I heard them push on the door. I even felt the air shift as the door creaked, but it held firm, thankfully still locked. I was too scared to peek outside or open the blinds, so I just waited. My heart was racing so fast, I thought I might pass out. The operator told me cops were on the way, so I tried to hold it together. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The jiggling, the pressure on the door, all of it. I was still frozen in fear, though unable to move or even look out the window to see if anyone was out there. When the cops finally arrived 20 minutes later, mind you, they questioned me like I was on something. They flat out asked if I was on drugs. I told them I was completely sober, which I was. I had a basketball game earlier in the day, so I didn't drink or smoke anything. I might drink a few times a week, but on that day, I was stone cold sober. I've even sworn off drinking since that night because of how shaken I've been. The cops didn't seem to care much. They did a quick check around the perimeter and left. Before going, they suggested I stay somewhere else for the night and told me to try and get a good look at the guy if it happened again. They said it might have been a homeless person who thought the place was vacant. But how could they think it was vacant when they could have easily heard Adam Sandler playing in the background? I was watching a damn movie in the living room, for crying out loud. When the cops left, that's when the panic attack hit me hard. I was shaking uncontrollably and started hyperventilating. It got so bad I fainted, just collapsing into some weird kind of shock. I stayed up all night after that, completely unable to sleep. As soon as the sun came up, I went outside to check things out. There wasn't anyone around, just trash scattered all over from stray cats getting into my bins. That's when I started overthinking everything. Could a cat have done that? I mean, I've seen videos of cats messing with doorknobs, but for 10 straight minutes, no way. Then I wondered if it could have been some other animal or maybe a crazy person who went through my trash before trying to get in. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I got. There were no signs that the lock had been picked, just some minor scratches on the wall, like someone had maybe tried sliding a card in or something. Nothing significant. Nothing was out of place. Could someone have just been messing with me, playing a twisted joke? Or maybe it was something even stranger, something paranormal. Hell, at one point, I even wondered if it was something not of this world, like some kind of extraterrestrial encounter. I know that sounds crazy, but after an experience like that, your mind goes places you'd never expect. Was it all in my head? Was I hallucinating? I don't know. I've never been diagnosed with any mental health issues, though I admit my mental state isn't always the best. But I've never had anything like this happen before. Could I really have imagined the whole thing? Or was someone actually trying to break in, and I just got lucky that I'd locked the door? I'm currently staying at my mom's house, trying to recover from the shock. I haven't slept in over 46 hours, and honestly, I don't know when I'll feel safe again. I'm just a relatively happy 23-year-old guy, though the happy part is debatable. I usually don't post stuff like this, but I needed to vent. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience and can help me make sense of it. If anyone's got any insight, I'm all ears. For now, I'm just trying to stay on my toes, because that was the closest I've ever felt to real danger, and it scared the hell out of me. Growing up, my mom always referred to me as her spirit child. Strange things seemed to happen around me, almost as if unseen forces were drawn to me. The events of this story unfolded when I was about 6 years old, and to this day, it remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. At the time, my mom, my brother, and I had just moved into a small, run-down apartment. We were going through hard times financially, and this was all we could afford. Little did we know we weren't the only ones living there. I've always had a weak bladder, something that's been a part of me for as long as I can remember. But during the 3 months we lived in that apartment, I developed an intense fear of the bathroom. It wasn't a childish reluctance to use the toilet or something silly like that. It was pure, bone-deep fear. I told my mom over and over again that I didn't want to go in there because of the lady. Every time I mentioned her, my mom would brush it off. She assumed it was just my overactive imagination, some kind of phase that kids go through. I could see her rolling her eyes whenever I said it, but I couldn't shake the terror that gripped me whenever I was near the bathroom. There was something wrong with that room. I could feel it in my bones, but no one seemed to believe me. As the days went by, my bathroom fear worsened. I started holding it in as long as I could, avoiding the bathroom altogether. My mom noticed and grew more and more frustrated, especially when I started wetting the bed at night. I felt embarrassed, but the fear of seeing the lady outweighed the embarrassment. It didn't matter what time of day it was, whether it was morning, afternoon, or the dead of night. I couldn't step foot in that bathroom without the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. One afternoon, my mom was outside, chatting with our neighbor about the usual stuff: work, rent, how much we hated the apartment. Frustrated, she mentioned how I refused to use the bathroom, and that's when the neighbor's face went pale. My mom would later tell me that the change in the neighbor's expression was so sudden, so severe, that it made her skin crawl. The neighbor hesitated before asking, "Has your daughter mentioned anything about seeing someone?" At this point, my mom was intrigued. "Yeah," she said, slightly confused. "She keeps talking about some lady in the bathroom." What the neighbor said next made my mom's stomach drop. Apparently, the apartment complex had a dark history that not many people talked about. A few years before we moved in, a woman who lived in our apartment had been brutally attacked by an intruder. He had broken into her home, and during the invasion, he beat her mercilessly. Despite her injuries, she survived the initial attack and tried to crawl to the front door, likely in a desperate attempt to escape. But before she could get there, he found her struggling with the lock. He didn't let her go. Instead, he beat her again, this time focusing on her head until she stopped moving. After killing her, the intruder dragged her body across the hall to an abandoned apartment. For days, no one knew what had happened to her. Her body lay hidden, rotting, until the landlord came to check on the empty apartment and discovered the grisly scene. The police eventually tracked the man down, and when he was caught, he confessed to everything, detailing the horrific attack and murder. My mom sat frozen as the neighbor finished telling her the story. The woman had died in that very apartment, the same apartment we now called home. All the pieces started falling into place for her. My fear of the bathroom, my mention of the lady, it all made sense now. When my mom came back inside after hearing the story, she was visibly shaken. She didn't tell me what she had learned right away, probably not wanting to scare me any more than I already was. But that night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the woman, her struggle to survive, and the violent way her life had been taken. It didn't take long for her to decide that we needed to leave. Within a week, we packed up our things and moved out of the apartment for good. My mom never mentioned the details of what had happened there until years later, when I was old enough to understand. Looking back, I now realized that my fear of the bathroom wasn't just some childish fear. There was someone in that apartment, and I had felt her presence in the most terrifying way. To this day, my mom calls me her spirit child, as if I have some connection to the other side. Whether that's true or not, I'll never know. But I do know this: I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in that apartment. I'll never forget the lady. Not long after our previous brush with the paranormal, we moved into a house surrounded by trailers. The area wasn't anything special, but the neighbors were friendly enough, and we quickly settled into our new lives there. At first, everything seemed peaceful, just a quiet life in a quiet neighborhood. But soon strange things started happening, and we realized this house had its own secrets, ones that refused to stay buried. It all started with my mom. My younger brother has always been a bit of a kleptomaniac when it comes to food. He would sneak into the kitchen late at night and steal snacks, thinking he could outsmart our parents. One night, my mom was half asleep when she saw the shadow of a young boy standing in the hallway. Immediately, she assumed it was my brother trying to sneak some more food. "Brother, get your ass in bed before I go get your dad," she yelled, not wanting to wake everyone else in the house. But the shadow didn't move. It just stood there, staring, not making a sound. My mom was already tired and irritated, so she looked away for a second, taking a deep breath to calm herself before she lost her temper. When she turned back, the boy was gone, just like that. No sound, no footsteps, nothing. Now, the weird part was that my brother's room was down the hall, and there was no way he could have moved that fast without making some noise. Feeling uneasy, my mom went to check on him. She found him sound asleep in bed, his breathing deep and steady like he'd been out cold for hours. There was no way he could have faked it. That was the first time my mom really started to believe something was wrong with the house. Then it happened to me. At the time, I had my own room, which I was excited about at first. But soon I found myself wanting to trade rooms with anyone just to get away from the terrifying figure I called the Headless Man. Every night, like clockwork, I would hear whispers coming from the closet. At first I thought it was my imagination, just the wind playing tricks on me, but the figure that would emerge from the shadows was very real. The Headless Man didn't have a face that I could see, just a dark, shadowy outline that stood in the doorway of my closet. He never moved, but he spoke. His voice was soft, almost soothing, but it filled me with an indescribable fear. He would try to coax me into the closet, whispering things like, "I have something very cool to show you, and your mother sent me." I was young, but not stupid. I knew better than to respond or acknowledge his presence. I would lie there, pretending to sleep, praying he would go away. It didn't matter how many times it happened, I never got used to it. Every night I lay there, frozen in terror, waiting for him to disappear back into the darkness. Those were the worst encounters, but the house wasn't done with us. Even in the daytime, strange things continued to happen. We would hear whispers in the walls, voices so faint you couldn't make out what they were saying, but loud enough to remind you that you weren't alone. Objects would move on their own, sometimes disappearing entirely only to show up in the most random places days later. The sensation of being watched was constant, as if unseen eyes were following your every move, waiting for you to let your guard down. Despite the haunting experiences, we stayed in the house for a few years. Life went on as normally as it could in a place like that. But the final blow came when my stepfather, who'd been battling his own demons after his divorce from my mom, took his own life in the very house. The grief and sadness from his death hung over us like a dark cloud, but it wasn't just emotional weight we were feeling. Something darker lingered. After his death, the strange occurrences intensify. At first, we didn't want to believe it. We wanted to move on, to heal. But there was no denying the eerie feeling that he hadn't really left us. We would hear footsteps when no one was home, feel cold drafts in rooms where the windows were sealed shut. My mom even swore she saw his shadow in the corner of her room one night, just standing there, watching her like the boy in the hall had done all those years ago. We didn't last much longer after that. Between the memories of my stepfather's death and the hauntings that had plagued us for so long, it was clear that staying in the house was slowly driving us all to the edge. We packed up and moved out as soon as we could, leaving behind the shadows and whispers that had haunted us for years. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something from that house followed us. After the divorce, my world was shaken even further. I was sent to live with my grandmother, who told me about my stepfather's tragic suicide. At the time, I was young and didn't fully grasp the weight of what had happened. It wasn't until years later that I learned what my mother had endured after his death, and it's a story that still chills me to the core. It all began about a month after his passing. My mother, left alone to deal with the aftermath of their broken marriage and his death, began experiencing strange occurrences in the house. At first, they were small, almost subtle, a pot or pan being tossed around the kitchen, seemingly on its own. It made sense in a haunting sort of way. He had been the family cook, always in the kitchen. My mom brushed it off, telling herself that grief could play tricks on the mind, but the whispers started soon after, and a voice so familiar that it was impossible to ignore. She knew it was him. The shadows were another thing. Stiff, still figures that would appear out of the corner of her eye, lingering for just a moment before vanishing. It was unsettling, but manageable. Or at least, that's what she thought. Then came the night that changed everything. My mom had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from another long day. In the early hours of the morning, she opened her eyes only to find him a few inches from her face. His presence was so close she could feel the air around her grow colder. She tried to scream, to move, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if something or someone was holding her down. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she was powerless to do anything but stare. She blinked, hoping it was just a nightmare, but when she opened her eyes again, he was gone. That's when the hauntings grew more violent. It started with a box being shoved down the hallway, an unmistakable force behind it, as if he was letting her know he was still there. She would feel him lying in bed next to her, the weight of his body pressing down on the mattress, his cold presence sending shivers down her spine. She knew it wasn't a dream. She was wide awake, trapped in this new reality where her deceased husband refused to let go. But the worst part, the climax of it all, was the nightmare that haunted her sleep every night. It always began the same way. Darkness, complete, impenetrable blindness. The air around her would turn icy, like being submerged in the deep ocean. For a few moments, there was only silence, a suffocating stillness that made her heart race. Then, out of nowhere, she would feel him behind her. His arms would wrap around her in a familiar embrace, his beard brushing against her shoulder, just like it used to when he was alive. He would whisper in her ear, his voice low and unintelligible, except for one sentence that she could never forget. "You could join me." With those words, something cold would appear in her hand-gun. She never remembered pulling the trigger, but she knew what happened next. Every time the dream would end the same way, and she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. The nightmare repeated night after night, leaving her exhausted and terrified. She tried everything, moving the furniture, changing rooms, even spending nights at a friend's house, but no matter where she went, the haunting followed her. He followed her. It took years for her to finally escape the grip of that house, and even longer to fully heal from the trauma of his death and the terror of his spirit. A few years ago, my best friend and I, both 20 at the time, were given the opportunity to stay at his grandparents' house while they were away for 6 months. Rent-free, no responsibilities, and plenty of space for us to relax. It seemed like a dream situation, but the house itself had a different vibe altogether, old, creepy, and especially unsettling at night. This house was built a long time ago and had an odd setup. His grandparents had separate bedrooms. His grandma's room was downstairs at the end of a long, eerie hallway, while his grandpa's room was upstairs on the opposite side of the house. My friend took the grandpa's room upstairs, and I stayed in the grandma's room downstairs. Her room was filled with old dolls, and every time I turned the knob to that bedroom door, it creaked, a detail that became very important later. For the first few days, nothing strange happened. We'd lock all the doors before going to bed, just like anyone else would, and there was never any sign that something was off, until one night I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I decided to turn in for the night. It was summer, so it was pretty hot, and I was sleeping on my stomach without any sheets covering me. In hindsight, it wasn't the most protective position to be in. Suddenly, I heard the doorknob. It creaked just like it always did when someone turned it. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just the knob releasing tension or something harmless like that. But then I flipped over in bed, and everything changed. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone walking down the hallway. They continued into the kitchen, and then came the loud banging noises, like someone was rummaging through the cabinets or slamming drawers. It was so loud that I thought it had to be my friend. After a few minutes, though, I started to wonder what the hell he was doing, so I called him. He picked up after a couple of rings, and I could tell from his groggy voice that he was upstairs, fast asleep. He was disoriented and just mumbled, "What's up?" I immediately told him I thought someone was in the house. We both got up, slowly and quietly creeping out of our rooms to check the place out. The house was completely still. We searched the kitchen, the living room, nothing. Not a sign of anyone or anything. At this point, I was seriously freaked out. I knew that I had heard something, someone. There was no denying that something was in the house. His grandpa's room had 2 beds, so I went upstairs to sleep in the extra bed, figuring I'd feel safer with him close by. But after about 5 minutes of lying there, I couldn't shake the feeling. "We need to check the house again," I said. "I know someone's in here." We reluctantly got up again and went back downstairs. This time something was different. The door to the grandma's room, the room I had been sleeping in, was shut. But not only that, it was locked. We walked over to check the back door, and it was wide open. That's when the fear really set in. I knew we had locked that door before going to bed. I turned back to the grandma's room. The door was definitely locked, and it wasn't something that could just shut on its own. I tried a few times later to replicate it, but the door had to be pushed hard to close all the way because the carpet at the bottom would catch it. It wasn't possible for a draft to do that. When we finally got the door unlocked, nothing inside had been touched. Everything was exactly where it had been before, but that didn't make me feel any better. There was no logical explanation for what had just happened. For the rest of the time we stayed there, I was on edge. I slept in my friend's room every night with the fan turned up on high just to drown out any possible sounds. Even in the winter, when it got cold, I left that fan on. I didn't want to hear anything that might be lurking in that house. For years, I've wondered what really happened that night. I've tried to rationalize it, coming up with different theories. Maybe someone heard that the house would be vacant for months and decided to squat there. But we never saw any signs of someone living there, and nothing ever went missing. I also considered the idea that it could have been some kind of animal. But again, there was no evidence of that either. No scratching, no droppings, nothing. And animals don't typically grab doorknobs. Recently, I watched a movie about people secretly living in homes without the owners knowing, and it got me thinking, could someone have been living there without us realizing? It seems far-fetched, but I can't completely rule it out. But if I'm being honest, I believe it was something else, something paranormal. From the moment I heard the doorknob creak, I felt like I was in the presence of something I couldn't see, something that wasn't meant to be there. I don't know what it was, and I still don't have an explanation. But if anyone has an idea, I'd love to hear it, because that night I was certain something was there with us. Then I started seeing strange reflections in windows and mirrors, shapes that shouldn't have been there, figures that seemed to move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, just like my parents had taught me. But soon, my encounters with the unknown became more intense. The first time I saw her, I was 8 years old. It was night time, and I had just gone to bed, but something made me sit up and glance across the room. There, at the end of my mother's bed, sat a little girl. She was pale, almost translucent, with long dark hair that hung over her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, just staring. The air felt cold, heavy, and in that moment my body froze in fear. Without thinking, I let out a scream and bolted downstairs to find my mom. She was watching TV. completely unaware of what I had just seen. When we went back upstairs together, the girl was gone. That was just the beginning. From that moment on, strange occurrences became part of my daily life. I would wake up in the morning to find scratches all over my arms, and leg scratches that I couldn't explain, as if something had been clawing at me in the night. More important things around the house started disappearing. Keys, toys, even my mother's jewelry, and the footsteps, they became a constant companion. At night I could hear them, soft but steady, echoing through the hallways as if someone or something was pacing back and forth. It felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking, waiting for the right moment. I felt like prey then. When I was 9, things escalated. I had fallen asleep as usual, but in the middle of the night I woke up with a jolt. Something cold was gripping my ankles. Before I could scream or even process what was happening, I was yanked out of my bed with such force that I hit the floor hard. The pain shot through me, but the fear was worse. I couldn't see what had pulled me, but I knew it wasn't human. My cries woke up the entire house. My family rushed in to find me sprawled on the floor, terrified. The way I had fallen, there was no way I could have simply slipped out of bed. It was clear to me that I had been dragged, but this was not the little girl. There was something darker, something more menacing. In our house, the energy had shifted. Whatever it wasn't just trying to scare me. It wanted something else, something much more sinister. As time passed, the little girl appeared less frequently, but when she did, her presence always left me with more questions than answers. One time I saw her again, but this time she wasn't just sitting idly. I found her in the bathroom, sitting in the tub, her small frame trembling as she cried. The sound of her sobs was soft, almost pitiful. I hesitated, but I asked, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. Instead, she bolted from the tub and disappeared into the hallway. That was the last time I saw her until 20 to 1, but fast forward to August of that year. It had been years since I'd seen the little girl, but I always felt her lingering presence. One evening, I kept hearing footsteps above me coming from the attic. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking carefully, trying not to be heard. Our attic is too high to climb into without assistance, and I didn't have the strength to pull myself up, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to tape my phone to a long stick and poke it up into the attic, hoping to catch something on video. When I reviewed the footage, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the far corner of the attic, the little girl stood, staring directly at the camera. Her face was pale and expressionless, just like the first time I saw her all those years ago. She only appeared for a brief moment, and then, as if she sensed I was watching, she vanished from the recording. That was the last time I saw her. But while the little girl's appearances have ceased, something much darker remains. That presence, the one that dragged me from my bed, has never left. I can feel it even now, passing through my bedroom at night, its heavy energy pressing down on me as I lie in bed. Sometimes I hear the faint creak of the floorboards under its weight. I know it's watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I don't know what it wants, but one thing is clear: it's after me, and I'm not sure how much longer I can evade it. About 10 years ago, my wife and I took our 2 young boys on a road trip. The boys were about 3 and 4 years old at the time, and we started our journey in Montpellier, France, driving through the southern parts of the country and into northern Spain. We spent a few days in Barcelona before heading down to a campsite in Tarragona, a peaceful coastal town. Where we had booked a safari tent by the beach, the campsite had a mix of tents, mobile homes, and campers. But the safari tents were something special, positioned right on the beach. They were large green tents on wooden platforms, each facing the sea about 50 meters away. There were about 5 of these tents lined up, and ours was at the far end. Each tent had a small interior kitchen, lounge section, with 2 separate bedrooms. Although we had turned both into one larger space for the kids, we settled in, played with the boys, had dinner, and eventually went to bed. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up with the urge to use the bathroom. The only problem was there wasn't a bathroom inside the tent. I'd have to go outside. I remember lying in bed for a while, listening to the wind and the sound of the waves crashing on the shore, trying to convince myself I didn't need to go. But eventually I accepted defeat. I carefully unzipped the flap to the lounge area, zipped it back up to keep the kids from wandering out, and then unzipped the main door to the tent. It was pretty dark out, but there was enough moonlight to see the sea in the distance. I wandered far enough away from the tent to ensure I was out of sight, and did what I had to do. As I finished and turned around, the moonlight helped me find my way back. I walked back up the wooden steps to the tent and unzipped the door, using the light from my iPhone to guide me. Once inside, I zipped the door shut behind me, and then opened the flap to the bedroom. The moment the flap opened, I heard a sound that I will never forget. It wasn't a scream exactly, but more of a sharp intake of breath, a noise of sheer terror. My eyes adjusted to the light just enough to see a man staring at me from the bed. Wide-eyed with fear. It hit me all at once. I was in the wrong tent. I don't know what came over me, but I calmly muttered something very British like, "Terribly sorry," as if that would fix the situation. I quickly spun around to unzip the door, all too aware that this poor man was probably too scared to move. I bolted out of his tent and rushed back to my own, hoping he wouldn't come running after me. Back in my tent, I woke my wife and told her what had happened. We both lay there for a while, half expecting the man to come knocking, but he never did. The next morning, feeling a bit sheepish, I decided to go over and apologize properly. But when I got to his tent, he was already gone. Whether he had packed up early because of me or had just left as planned, I'll never know. All I know is that I probably gave him one of the biggest frights of his life. To this day, my wife and I still laugh about it. But I can't help but wonder how many times that poor guy has told the story of the night a random man wandered into his tent in the middle of the night. My wife and I had been living in our rented flat for about 2 months. It was a quiet place, just the 2 of us in a modest apartment building. Life was peaceful, and we were settling into our routine. Our neighbors were a married couple with 2 kids, and though we never interacted much, they seemed like an ordinary family. Little did I know, this illusion of normalcy was about to be shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. It all started innocuously enough. One evening, my wife mentioned hearing strange noises coming from the flat next door. I dismissed it, thinking it was probably just the kids playing or the sound of their daily life. The walls between the flats were thin, and it wasn't uncommon to hear some noises here and there. My wife, however, was insistent that it wasn't just regular sounds. She described it as odd thumping noises, sometimes followed by strange dragging sounds. But, being skeptical, I shrugged it off, telling her it was nothing to worry about. That was the biggest mistake I ever made. The next night, we were lying in bed when the noises started again. This time I heard it 2 loud, muffled thuds, followed by silence, and then the sounds of something being moved. It was too late for anyone to be up making such noises, and the way they echoed through the walls felt unnatural. My wife's anxiety spiked, and I could see the fear etched in her face. She begged me to do something. Reluctantly, I agreed, telling myself it was probably nothing, but deep down, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. Then the sounds grew louder, like someone was dragging heavy furniture across the floor, except it didn't sound like furniture at all. It was something different, something wrong. My wife and I exchanged worried glances, and finally we decided to call the police. When the officers arrived, we explained what we had been hearing. They took us seriously, especially given the hour and the increasing volume of the noises. We stood outside, watching as they knocked on the neighbor's door. There was no answer. The police officers announced their presence a few more times, but still no response. After waiting a while and not hearing anything from inside, they forced the door open. What they found inside was beyond anything I could have ever imagined, and to this day, I wish I could erase the memory from my mind. The officers cautiously entered the flat while we waited in the hallway. We heard them moving through the rooms, their voices muffled as they called for backup. It wasn't long before one of them came back out, his face pale, as if he had seen something that deeply disturbed him. The other officers were already on the phone, speaking in low, hurried tones. My heart sank, and I knew something was terribly wrong. A few minutes later, one of the officers pulled us aside and gently told us to leave the building. They wouldn't go into detail at first, but the look in their eyes said it all. Still, my mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened next door. After hours of waiting and questioning, we finally learned the horrific truth. Inside the flat, the police had discovered 2 small corpses, both child-sized. The sight was so gruesome that even the most experienced officers were shaken. The children had been dead for some time, their bodies showing signs of severe neglect and abuse. The air in the flat was thick with the stench of death, and the rooms were in complete disarray. But there was more. The parents, our neighbors, were nowhere to be found. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind their children's lifeless bodies. The police launched an extensive search for the couple, but no one could find them. It was as if they had disappeared off the face of the earth. To this day, their whereabouts remain a mystery. The revelation was sickening, and my wife and I were left reeling from the shock. How could something so horrifying happen right next door, and we had no idea? We had lived just a thin wall away from this unimaginable horror, completely unaware of the tragedy unfolding beside us. Without the noises we had heard those nights, they were no ordinary sounds. The thuds, the dragging, it was the horrifying aftermath of the children's deaths. The parents, perhaps in their panic or twisted minds, had been moving the bodies, trying to hide the evidence of their crime. The thought of it still makes my stomach turn. In the days that followed, my wife and I couldn't stay in the flat any longer. The memories, the knowledge of what had happened were too much to bear. We packed up our things and moved out as quickly as possible, seeking a fresh start somewhere far from the nightmare that had unfolded. Even now, in our new home, I can't shake the feeling of dread that lingers whenever I think about those 2 innocent lives that were cut short in the most horrifying way. We're safe now, living in peace, and expecting a child of our own soon. But the haunting memories of that flat will always stay with us, a dark reminder of how fragile the line is between normalcy and terror. To this day, no one knows what became of our neighbors or why they did what they did. The case remains unsolved, and their disappearance is an eerie mystery that still sends chills down my spine. All I know is that I'll never forget those nights and the sounds that signaled the horror next door. When I was around 10 or 11, I experienced something that I'll never forget, something that has haunted me for years. One night I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move. At that age, I had never heard of sleep paralysis, so naturally, I had no idea what was happening to me. All I knew was that my body refused to respond to my commands. It felt like I was trapped in a body that was no longer mine, and that terrified me. I remember lying in bed, trying to figure out why I couldn't move. My room was dimly lit, bathed in the faintest glow from the moon outside my window, and the small green light from my computer's power button cast eerie shadows across the walls. As I scanned the room, I had this growing sensation that I was being watched. The feeling gnawed at me, sending chills down my spine. But what made my heart truly stop was when I saw a dark, slender hand slowly rising from the foot of my bed. The hand looked unnatural, twisted, and wrong. It was long and thin, with fingers that seemed to stretch on forever, each one at least a foot long. They curled as if reaching for something or someone. My first instinct was to scream for my dad, but my mouth wouldn't move. I was stuck in this horrible, silent panic, forced to watch as the hand crept closer. I should explain that my bed wasn't just any ordinary bed. It was a loft bed, the kind that's raised like a bunk bed but without the lower bunk. Instead, I had a desk underneath where I kept my computer. To get into bed, I had to climb a small ladder. So the fact that this hand was reaching up from below made it even worse. Knowing there was nothing underneath but empty space and my desk, the bed began to tremble as the creature attached to the hand climbed upward, making it slow, deliberate ascent. With no way to move or scream, the only thing I could do was close my eyes and hope it would go away. I squeezed them shut as hard as I could, trying to block out the nightmare unfolding before me. After a few agonizing seconds, I opened my eyes, praying the creature would be gone. For a brief moment, I thought it had worked. The hand was gone, and the room was still. But then, to my horror, the bed shook again, and that same hand began to rise from the foot of my bed once more. My heart raced. It felt like the nightmare had restarted, and I was trapped in a loop I couldn't escape from. I closed my eyes again, refusing to open them for what felt like forever. When I finally did, the hand had disappeared, but I wasn't naive enough to believe it was over. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the bed shook for a third time, and the hand emerged again. This time I didn't close my eyes right away. I felt a strange curiosity, an urge to see just how far this thing would go. Would it stop at my feet? Would it keep coming? I needed to know, so I kept my eyes open longer than before, watching as the creature slowly pulled itself onto the bed. And then I saw it, the face. I don't even know how to describe it. It was pale and almost cartoonish, but the way it moved wasn't natural. Its movements were jerky, like watching a glitchy video playing at a low frame rate. The face didn't belong to the dark, misty body that carried it. It was as if two different entities were mashed together, and the result was something deeply disturbing. Fear paralyzed me in a way I had never felt before. I wanted to run, to scream, to call out for help, but I couldn't. I was completely and utterly helpless, forced to watch this nightmarish figure get closer and closer. Once again, I closed my eyes, desperate to make it go away. This time I kept them shut longer than I ever had before, counting slowly in my head, hoping against hope that when I opened them the creature would be gone for good. After what felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath and cautiously opened my eyes, and that's when I saw it, the creature's face, inches from mine. I could feel its presence, its cold breath brushing against my skin. It was so close I could see every unnatural detail of its pale, distorted face. My heart felt like it was about to explode from my chest. If I could have screamed, I would have. But I couldn't. I was trapped in silence, face to face with a being I couldn't comprehend. In one final act of desperation, I squeezed my eyes shut as hard as I could, refusing to open them until I was certain it was gone. Slowly, I felt the paralysis start to fade. My muscles loosened, and I realized I could move again. Cautiously, I opened my eyes, half expecting the creature to still be there, but it was gone. For a moment, I felt relieved, but the relief didn't last. I wanted to run to my parents' room to feel safe again, but even though I could move, I found myself paralyzed in a different way, paralyzed by fear. What if the creature came back? What if it was waiting for me in the hallway? My mind raced with questions and fears, and all I could do was lie there, trembling under the covers, wondering what had just happened. That night changed me. I've experienced sleep paralysis since then, but nothing like that first encounter. To this day, I still wonder if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if something far darker was lurking in the shadows of my childhood bedroom. All I know is that I'll never forget the night I came face to face with the creeping hand. It was a typical evening, or so I thought. I was 15, sitting at my desk, watching YouTube with my friend on Discord. We were deep into watching break-in stories, the kind that always made your heart race, even though you knew they weren't happening to you. We laughed and joked, but in the back of my mind, a creeping sense of unease was beginning to settle. It all started when my phone pinged, notifying me that the front door was unlocked. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, my parents were out running errands and had told me they'd be home soon. They always unlocked the door the moment they got home, so I figured they'd arrive. No big deal. But then 5 minutes passed, then 10. Usually, when my parents got home, they would call out to me or check in to see what I was up to. This time, nothing. The house was dead silent. A slight chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just paranoia from all the break-in stories we had been watching. Still, something about the door being unlocked and the eerie quietness gnawed at me. I told my friend on Discord that I was going to check things out and turn my microphone volume up as high as it would go just in case something went wrong, and he needed to hear everything. If someone was in the house, he could call the police. With that thought in mind, I opened my bedroom door. The moment I stepped out into the hallway, an unsettling feeling washed over me. All the lights outside of my room were off. My parents always left a few lights on, especially in the living room and kitchen. But tonight it was pitch dark. That gnawing feeling of suspicion quickly turned into a full-blown sense of dread. Trying to calm myself, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, offering some comfort, but my legs were already shaking. I told myself it was all in my head, but when I made it downstairs, things got worse. My dog, who always sat by the front door or in his usual spot near the couch, was nowhere to be seen. I called his name softly, but there was no response. That's when my heart began racing. He never ignored me. Something was off. I bolted back upstairs, fear overtaking any sense of calm I had tried to maintain. I jumped back onto Discord and told my friend everything, my voice shaky as I described the situation. I switched to my phone, turned on my camera, and stayed on the call with him as I prepared to search the house more thoroughly. I gave him my address and told him if something happened, he should call the police right away. The thought of someone inside my house had me on edge, but I knew I had to check every corner. I headed back down the stairs, my legs trembling with each step. The idea of running back to my room and hiding crossed my mind more than once, but I forced myself to keep moving. I knew I had to finish what I started, no matter how badly I wanted to just stay under my blankets. When I reached the garage, I spotted a green wiffle ball bat and snatched it up like it was a life-saving weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Armed with my flimsy bat and phone in hand, I kept going. I walked into the kitchen and saw something strange, a cup sitting on the counter that wasn't supposed to be there. We hadn't left any dishes out. The leash, my dog's leash, was also missing from its usual spot. My stomach twisted in knots. I quickly texted my mom and dad, asking if they had taken the dog for a walk. No response. Anxiety gripped me tighter. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the counter for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I knew I couldn't stop now, so I went back upstairs, clutching the bed even tighter. My hands were sweating, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I checked my room again, then the hallway, then finally made my way to my parents' room. I flipped on the light and scanned the space. Everything seemed normal until I heard a noise behind me. It was subtle, just a small clatter. But in that moment, it might as well have been a gunshot. My heart leapt into my throat, and I whirled around, bat raised, ready to face whoever or whatever was there. That's when I saw it. My dog's leash had fallen to the floor, hitting the ground with a soft thud. I froze, staring at the leash, waiting for something else to happen. And then, finally, I heard the front door open. My parents had come home. I exhaled a long, shaky breath, realizing what had happened. They had taken the dog for a walk without telling me, and I had worked myself into a frenzy over nothing. My friend was still on the call, waiting in tense silence as I explained that everything was fine, just a case of paranoia getting the better of me. That night was the first time I'd ever truly felt terrified in my own home. Maybe it was the break-in stories I'd been watching, or maybe it was something deeper, a primal fear of the unknown. Either way, the sensation of helplessness, of being unsure what was lurking in the dark, stuck with me long after the incident. And even though everything turned out to be perfectly fine, that experience changed me. I learned that fear can come from the smallest of things, a nose, a missing dog, or an unlocked door. And sometimes that fear is enough to make your heart stop, even if just for a moment. My roommate constantly listens to horror stories to fall asleep, and they've been nagging me to post my own weird experiences for a while. I've had a couple, but I think it's time I start with the most recent one. Now, I'm not the best at telling stories, and English isn't my first language, so bear with me as I try to share what happened. A bit of context. I'm a fashion student, and earlier that day, I had been photographing a model wearing one of my designs from my portfolio. It was a delicate, exaggerated dress with layers of fabric, and I didn't have time to properly fold it to put in my bag. I was already running late for the last train home, so in a rush, I decided to just wear it myself. I'm a guy, by the way, and wearing this elaborate dress definitely wasn't something I was used to. Still, I threw it on, grabbed my things, and bolted out the door. It was around 10 p.m. when I finally caught my train. The night had already settled in, and there were very few people around. I slid into an empty section, relieved to be alone. At that moment, the thought of being dressed in such an exaggerated outfit on an almost empty train was a relief. The last thing I wanted was people staring or making comments. A few minutes later, another guy entered my section. At first, He didn't do much except glance in my direction. Not a full-on stare, but just enough for me to notice I felt my skin crawl. I told myself it was just because I was wearing something you wouldn't expect to see on a guy, especially on public transport at night. I figured he was probably confused, maybe curious, but nothing more. 10 minutes passed, and then the man stood up and went to the train's restroom. I relaxed a little, but when he returned, something felt off. Instead of sitting back where he had been, he walked past me and took a seat a few rows behind. My stomach tightened. It's strange, but at that moment I became acutely aware of how vulnerable I probably looked. I was wearing a dress. I'm pretty skinny. I have long hair, and my face was covered with a mask. I realized that from behind I could easily be mistaken for a woman sitting alone on an empty train. That's when my anxiety kicked into overdrive. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, but part of me thought about pulling my mask down just to show him that I had a beard and was actually a guy. Maybe that would make him leave me alone, or at least not think I was an easy target. But then another thought crossed my mind, one that made me even more uneasy. What if showing him that I was a guy didn't help? What if it made things worse? I didn't want to be politically incorrect, but based on his age and appearance, I worried that if he thought I was playing dress-up or something, it could provoke a much darker reaction. What if he was one of those people who could turn violent in a situation like this? The possibility that I could end up being hate crimed raced through my mind. I was on edge, my body stiff, every muscle tense. I had a pair of scissors in my bag, and I found myself gripping them tightly. If something happened, I thought, at least I'd have some kind of defense. As if the situation wasn't nerve-wracking enough. My phone suddenly rang. The sound almost made me jump out of my skin. It was one of my friends calling. I answered out of reflex, trying to keep my voice steady. I turned slightly in my seat, making sure I could still keep an eye on the guy sitting behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but talking to my friend gave me a small sense of relief. Surely, now that he could hear me speak, he would realize I wasn't a girl. Those 10 minutes until my stop felt like an eternity. Every second was a battle between the urge to look back and check on him and the fear of making direct eye contact. When the train finally slowed down, signaling that my stop was coming up, I knew I'd have to pass him to get to the door. My legs felt weak as I stood up, but I forced myself to walk, gripping my bag and the scissors inside. As I passed him, I tried not to look, but curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced back. That's when I saw it. Sticking out of his jacket, just barely visible, was a small handle. It was wooden and rough, like the kind of handle you'd find on a fishing knife. My breath hitched. Maybe it wasn't a knife, but I couldn't think of anything else it could be. All my instincts screamed at me to get off the train as fast as possible. The doors opened, and I practically ran out of the station. Once I was far enough away, I called the police and told them everything that had happened. I didn't know if they'd take me seriously, but they did. They listened to my statement carefully, asking detailed questions. But in the end, they couldn't find the guy. He had disappeared into the night, and no one knew who he was or what he'd planned to do. To this day, the thought of that night sends chills down my spine. I can't shake the feeling that if things had played out just a little differently, I might not be here to tell this story. And it makes me think about all the women who have to face situations like that regularly, how they live with that constant fear of being watched, followed, or worse. It's an experience that completely changed the way I see the world. Now, I can barely bring myself to take public transport at night. The fear never really goes away. In my hometown of Nashville, we had quite the wild ride during the winter semester of my senior year. Mrs. Harper, our beloved science teacher, went on maternity leave, and that's when things got interesting. First, we had this substitute who was, for lack of a better word, a complete psycho. She only lasted 2 weeks before getting into an argument with the principal over the differences between science and religion. After that train wreck, we got Mr. Christensen. Now, Mr. Christensen wasn't your average teacher. The first thing he did when he walked into the science lab was redecorate it with his taxidermy collection. And when I say collection, I mean he had a whole menagerie of animals he'd preserved himself. It freaked a lot of people out, especially the younger kids. He had all sorts of creatures stationed around the room, an armadillo on his desk, a raccoon on top of the chemistry cabinet, and a possum with unsettlingly bright eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. While most of my classmates were creeped out, I was fascinated. I found myself staying after class to chat with Mr. Christensen and examine his work. He explained that taxidermy had been his hobby since high school, and he seemed genuinely proud of it. I remembered telling him how real the animals looked, especially their eyes, which seemed to hold a strange lifelike quality. He beamed at the compliment, more used to hearing gasps and complaints than admiration. Mr. Christensen had this odd way of talking about eyes. He said they were the key to great taxidermy, but he didn't stop there. He went on about how eyes are the windows to our souls, and not just humans, animals too. He believed eyes captured the essence of a creature, something deeper than just life. At the time, it seemed eccentric, but harmless. Fast forward about 10 years. By then, I was working in Nashville and married. My wife and I had developed this habit of watching crime scene investigation shows before bed. It was our way of unwinding. One night, we were watching an episode about a serial killer, and when they showed a photo of the suspect on the screen, I screamed, "That's Bill Christensen," I shouted. My wife looked at me like I was crazy. But there he was, my senior year science teacher, not as a victim, but as the killer. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. For 3 months, we had a serial killer teaching us about biology and chemistry. The crime documentary went on to explain that Mr. Christensen had committed a series of gruesome murders, mutilating his victims in horrific ways. But the worst part, he took trophies, and if you've already guessed what kind of trophies, you're right, he took their eyes. My mind raced back to that classroom, to his taxidermy collection, to all those times we talked about how important the eyes were. Suddenly, all those conversations he had took on a terrifying new meaning. He wasn't just talking about the eyes of animals, he was obsessed. I wondered if his fascination with taxidermy had blurred the line between his hobby and his horrific crimes. For months he taught us in that lab, all the while harboring this grotesque obsession, and we never knew. Even now, the thought of it chills me to the bone. How could we not have seen the signs? How could I not have known? Looking back, those animals, those lifeless eyes staring back at us from every corner of the lab weren't just creepy decorations. They were a warning, a glimpse into the darkness that was lurking behind Mr. Christensen's calm, composed exterior. Even today, whenever I see an animal with glassy, lifelike eyes, I can't help but think of him and the terrifying reality of what was hidden beneath his seemingly normal facade. I'm an avid catfisher, and there's nothing I enjoy more than being out by the water late at night when everything is calm and peaceful. The stillness of the night, the tug on the line, the quiet solitude, it's all part of why I fish at night especially on non-work nights. That love for night fishing led me to this particular night at a lake where I had one of the most chilling experiences of my life. I don't remember exactly what day it was, but I was fishing alone. My girlfriend at the time didn't feel like coming, and none of my friends wanted to join me, so I figured I'd go by myself. I packed up my gear, grabbed my gun just in case, and headed to the lake. I spent a few hours fishing, caught a few decent-sized catfish, and everything seemed normal at first. While I was out there, I started hearing voices like people talking, but I couldn't see anyone. I figured maybe it was someone walking down the road nearby. No big deal. I went back to fishing, shrugging it off. Fast forward a few hours. It's getting late, and I hear a whistle. I look around, but there's no one in sight. Again, I don't think much of it and keep fishing. But then I hear another whistle, this time coming from my right. It wasn't a casual whistle either. It was the kind someone does to get your attention. I scanned the area, but nothing. I assumed it was just some kids messing around. But the air felt different and easy. I turn around and see a cat nearby, which doesn't seem unusual at the time. Cats are everywhere, but then I hear a third whistle, this time directly behind me. When I looked, the cat was gone. At that point, I decided to reel in my lines. I didn't want to lose my expensive poles and keep my hand on my gun. I walked quietly around the nearby building, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. And with all the gravel around, I should have heard footsteps if anyone was there. That's when it happened. A sharp, shrill whistle came from right behind me. It was so loud and sudden that I spun around, drawing my gun. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I grabbed my stuff as fast as I could and sprinted to my cart. A week later, I'm back at the same lake, this time with a friend. I had pretty much forgotten about the whistling incident by then. We set up our gear, started fishing, and everything seemed fine. But as the night wore on, I started noticing strange shadows moving in the trees across the lake. It looked like something was darting near the lights, jumping around, but it was too far away to make out clearly. I assumed it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but the feeling of unease started creeping back. It was close to 3 a.m. when I began hearing people talking again, just like the last time. But there was no one in sight. The lake is set up like a pit, with roads all around it, so it's impossible to miss someone walking by. I looked at my friend, and he seemed on edge too. We tried to shake it off and keep fishing, but things got weirder. Around 3:15 a.m., I started hearing birds chirping. Now it's the middle of the night, and I know birds don't chirp at that hour. I turned to my friend and asked, "Do you hear that? Birds at 3 a.m.? Weird, right?" He looked around, clearly unnerved, and replied, "Those aren't birds chirping. Someone's mimicking them." I laughed it off at first, but he wasn't joking. He reminded me of a story a coworker had told me about this lake. The reason they don't let people swim here anymore. As soon as he mentioned how many people had died at this lake, everything stopped. The wind died. The crickets went silent. The fish, which had been tugging on my line just moments before, stopped biting. The air felt heavy, thick with something dark and unexplainable. "Do you feel that?" my friend asked. I nodded, my chest tightening as if the air had turned to stone. A deep sense of dread settled over us, and he looked at me with wide eyes, saying, "We need to get out of here now." Without another word, we packed up our gear as quickly as we could. The eerie bird sounds started up again, but we ignored them, focusing on getting our stuff to the car. As we were making our way back, my friend suddenly spun around, drawing his knife. I pulled out my gun, thinking something or someone was coming for us. "We have to go now," he shouted, We jumped in the car and sped off. It wasn't until we were safely down the road that I turned to him and asked, "What did you see back there?" He looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. Something was charging at us, man. I don't know what it was, but it was running right at me. I don't know what we experienced that night. I don't believe in ghosts or werewolves or any of that paranormal stuff, but this was different. Even writing this out now, I get chills. Something wasn't right, and I still can't explain what it was. If anyone has any idea what I might have experienced, I'd love to hear it, because whatever it was, it scared the hell out of me. I'm an avid catfisher, and there's nothing I enjoy more than being out by the water late at night when everything is calm and peaceful. The stillness of the night, the tug on the line, the quiet solitude, it's all part of why I fish at night, especially on non-work nights. That love for night fishing led me to this particular night at a lake where I had one of the most chilling experiences of my life. I don't remember exactly what day it was, but I was fishing alone. My girlfriend at the time didn't feel like coming, and none of my friends wanted to join me, so I figured I'd go by myself. I packed up my gear, grabbed my gun just in case, and headed to the lake. I spent a few hours fishing, caught a few decent-sized catfish, and everything seemed normal at first. While I was out there, I started hearing voices like people talking, but I couldn't see anyone. I figured maybe it was someone walking down the road nearby. No big deal. I went back to fishing, shrugging it off. Fast forward a few hours. It's getting late, and I hear a whistle. I look around, but there's no one in sight. Again, I don't think much of it and keep fishing. But then I hear another whistle, this time coming from my right. It wasn't a casual whistle either. It was the kind someone does to get your attention. I scanned the area, but nothing. I assumed it was just some kids messing around. But the air felt different and easy. I turn around and see a cat nearby, which doesn't seem unusual at the time. Cats are everywhere, but then I hear a third whistle, this time directly behind me. When I looked, the cat was gone. At that point, I decided to reel in my lines. I didn't want to lose my expensive poles and keep my hand on my gun. I walked quietly around the nearby building, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. And with all the gravel around, I should have heard footsteps if anyone was there. That's when it happened. A sharp, shrill whistle came from right behind me. It was so loud and sudden that I spun around, drawing my gun. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I grabbed my stuff as fast as I could and sprinted to my cart. A week later, I'm back at the same lake, this time with a friend. I had pretty much forgotten about the whistling incident by then. We set up our gear, started fishing, and everything seemed fine. But as the night wore on, I started noticing strange shadows moving in the trees across the lake. It looked like something was darting near the lights, jumping around, but it was too far away to make out clearly. I assumed it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but the feeling of unease started creeping back. It was close to 3 a.m. when I began hearing people talking again, just like the last time. But there was no one in sight. The lake is set up like a pit, with roads all around it, so it's impossible to miss someone walking by. I looked at my friend, and he seemed on edge too. We tried to shake it off and keep fishing, but things got weirder. Around 3:15 a.m., I started hearing birds chirping. Now it's the middle of the night, and I know birds don't chirp at that hour. I turned to my friend and asked, "Do you hear that? Birds at 3 a.m.? Weird, right?" He looked around, clearly unnerved, and replied, "Those aren't birds chirping. Someone's mimicking them. I laughed it off at first, but he wasn't joking. He reminded me of a story a coworker had told me about this lake, the reason they don't let people swim here anymore. As soon as he mentioned how many people had died at this lake, everything stopped. The wind died. The crickets went silent. The fish, which had been tugging on my line just moments before, stopped biting. The air felt heavy, thick with something dark and unexplainable. Do you feel that? My friend asked. I nodded, my chest tightening as if the air had turned to stone. A deep sense of dread settled over us, and he looked at me with wide eyes, saying, "We need to get out of here now." Without another word, we packed up our gear as quickly as we could. The eerie bird sounds started up again, but we ignored them, focusing on getting our stuff to the car. As we were making our way back, my friend suddenly spun around, drawing his knife. I pulled out my gun, thinking something or someone was coming for us. "We have to go now," he shouted. We jumped in the car and sped off. It wasn't until we were safely down the road that I turned to him and asked, "What did you see back there?" He looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. Something was charging at us, man. I don't know what it was, but it was running right at me. I don't know what we experienced that night. I don't believe in ghosts or werewolves or any of that paranormal stuff, but this was different. Even writing this out now, I get chills. Something wasn't right, and I still can't explain what it was. If anyone has any idea what I might have experienced, I'd love to hear it, because whatever it was, it scared the hell out of me. I wanted to post about something that happened while I was camping in my van at Rainier National Park yesterday. The whole experience feels like a haze, and I have only fragmented memories of what occurred. However, there's undeniable physical evidence that something did happen, though I can't quite piece it together. Let me provide some context. I'm a 23-year-old guy, and over the weekend I went to a van life meetup in Enumclaw, Washington, a city near Rainier National Park. Since I had already made the trip, I decided to camp overnight at a dispersed campsite in the forest near the park. I brought ingredients for carne asada tacos, downloaded a couple of movies, and was ready for a quiet, cozy evening, something I usually do on weekends at various campsites around the state. After parking my van, I took a hike around the campsite. The area was beautiful, but I was saddened by the amount of trash scattered about. Clearly, it had been neglected for some time. The trail led me to a couple of fire pits not far from my van, which seemed like a place local teens might hang out to party. I even saw a log bench with for 120 painted across it. The fire pits had some half-drunk cans lying around, but they felt cool to the touch. It wasn't cold outside, about 70 degrees, but I couldn't tell how recently people had been there. Regardless, I decided to stay. The spot wasn't completely isolated. Every half hour or so, a car or truck would drive by to claim other nearby campsites along the fire road. I figured everyone was just trying to get some peace in nature like me. After a bit more exploring, I went back to my van to cook dinner. Using my satellite communicator, I checked in with friends and family. As there was no cell service this deep in the woods, as the sun set, I sat down in my van to eat my tacos, leaving the doors open to let the cool breeze flow in. It was peaceful at first, but then I started hearing something strange in the distance. It sounded like gunshots, loud, rhythmic booms that echoed through the valley every few seconds. Along with those noises, I could also hear the sound of a chainsaw revving, though it was further off. Neither of those noises are particularly unusual for rural camping in Washington. People love their guns, and I've seen plenty of folks cutting up firewood with chainsaws. Fire bans be damned. What was unusual, though, was when an RV backed up and left in the middle of the night. That struck me as odd because finding a good spot for an RV at night is hard, and leaving after dark is something most campers try to avoid. I wondered if they knew something I didn't and briefly considered leaving myself. But I was settled in, my dishes were unwashed, and I wasn't in the mood to pack up, so I stayed. Before I went to sleep, I made sure to triple check that all the doors and windows in my van were locked. I wasn't taking any chances. That night, everything became a blur. The best way to describe it is hazy and disorienting. I remember waking up at some point in the pitch black of night, feeling like I was drowning. My lungs were filling with air, but I had the desperate sensation of suffocating. I remember flailing, trying to punch out a window, but nothing worked. I remember stumbling to the side door of my van, desperately trying to open it for air, and then I woke up in my bed with the sun shining in the sky. I would have written it off as a bad dream, except for the damage surrounding me. There was clear evidence that something happened. My window blinds were sliced up. One of the windows had scratch marks on the inside, and my ceiling air vent was broken like something smashed it from within. My knuckles and feet were sore, probably from hitting them against the cabinets in my van while trying to get out. A pole I used to prop up my canopy was lying broken on the floor. The strangest part, my van had been well ventilated, and my carbon monoxide detector was silent. There was no reason for me to have had trouble breathing in the first place. The only other time I've experienced anything like this was a few months ago, and it also happened near Mt. Rainier National Park. My friends and I were driving around in Unclaw late at night, looking for a place to camp. A local gave us a tip about some dispersed camping spots, so we decided to check them out. The area we found was weird and even, unsettling, with the trees creaking ominously in the wind. We ended up calling this spot the Ominous Slant. That night, my friend Melissa swore she heard squeaking noises, like someone wearing latex, which she jokingly referred to as the Happy Gimper. Her boyfriend, Kurt, thought he heard a bear, but the scariest part, they both heard me scream bloody murder from inside my van in the middle of the night. Kurt rushed over, tripping in his panic, only to find me fast asleep. I had no memory of screaming or even having a nightmare since that night. I've camped in various places, and nothing like this has ever happened except at Mt. Rainier. The feeling of drowning in darkness was overwhelming, and I'm not eager to revisit the park anytime soon. Whatever happened that night, it left me shaken. I still don't know what to make of it, but I'm done camping near Mt. Rainier. Something about that place just doesn't sit right with me. For a little bit of context, I've owned my house for about 13 years now, and it was built in the early 90s. Over the years, there haven't been many significant occurrences, mostly just small, odd things like cabinets being open and no one's touched them, or doors mysteriously shifting on their own. Nothing that ever made me question things too much. But recently, something happened that grabbed my attention in a way I couldn't shake off. It was a regular afternoon, and I was in the master bedroom getting ready to take a shower. Just for clarity, the master bedroom has its own attached bathroom, and there's only one main entrance through the hallway door. The bedroom door was shut and locked, as it always is when I'm showering, and I'd left the bathroom door slightly open to let out some of the steam. The water was running, and everything felt routine, at least, until I heard the knock. I was just about to finish up when I distinctly heard 5 firm knocks on the bedroom door. They were loud, deliberate, and close enough to be unmistakable. It startled me at first, but then I figure it was probably my brother playing some sort of prank. That's just the kind of thing he'd do. Without thinking much of it, I called out, "Hold on, I'll be right out," expecting him to get a laugh out of my reaction once I was done. I quickly dried off and got dressed, already half smiling at the thought of catching my brother in the act. But as I stepped out of the bathroom into the bedroom, something wasn't right. The main bedroom door, which I had locked from the inside, was slightly open, a small crack of space between the door and the frame. I froze for a second, staring at the door, trying to process what I was seeing. Not now. Let me be clear, the door was still locked. The latch was visibly engaged, yet somehow the door was creaked open. It made no sense. I stood there in disbelief, my mind racing through the possibilities. Maybe my brother had picked the lock and was hiding nearby. That was the only explanation that made sense at the moment. Determined to catch him in the act, I swung open the bedroom door and searched the entire house. I checked every room, his bedroom, the bathrooms, even the closet, calling his name as I went. But there was no response. And then it hit me. I was the only one home. No one else had been there the entire time. I walked outside to check the driveway just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind, and sure enough, my car was the only one there. No signs of anyone coming or going. The house was eerily silent, and suddenly the knock didn't feel like a joke anymore. I tried to piece together what could have happened. Maybe there was some logical explanation I was missing. I double-checked the windows and doors, wondering if the breeze or air pressure could have pushed the door open. But the AC wasn't even on that day. Besides, I distinctly remembered locking the door behind me when I went to shower. There was no breeze, no airflow strong enough to move a locked door. That's when I thought about my dogs. Maybe they had somehow managed to get out of the gated hallway and push the door open. But that theory quickly fell apart, too. We had a gate installed to keep the dogs out of the bedroom and the rest of the house while I showered. Even if they had gotten through, which they hadn't, the door was still locked. It wasn't just a simple case of it being left ajar. It had been locked and secured. As I stood there in the quiet of my empty house, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, knocking on that door, waiting for me to open it. But what or who? I don't have any definitive answers. All I know is that something strange happened that day, something that defied logic and explanation. I've tried replaying the events in my mind, but nothing makes sense. The door was locked. I was alone. There was no breeze, no prank, no easy explanation, and ever since that day I can't help but feel uneasy whenever I'm alone in the house. Every creak, every sound makes me wonder if something or someone is still there, lurking just out of sight. It's the kind of experience that leaves you questioning what's real and what's just beyond our understanding.